So, welcome everybody to Mad on Books and the inaugural episode of Friends on Books. I wanted to start chatting with people. I don't know if we can really call each other friends yet, but hopefully after this, we definitely can.
We can call some of us can call each other's nemesis, actually.
You can do that right now. I have no problems with you doing that immediately. You've been doing it already a lot anyway. I am almost certain that anyone who might be watching knows all three of you better than they know me, but why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves anyway?
Starting with
up at the top, AP.
Right. First of all, Matt, you do realize that on our screens, we're not necessarily seeing the same thing that you see on your screen.
Yeah, no, I'm just picking the guy on top based on my screen. But I said your name. Come on, don't be pissy.
Well, I'm AP, and my channel is A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in films, television, and in books, as I say at the beginning of nearly every video.
I've never pointed that out before.
Yes, and of course, I've been doing this read along with Dr. Philip Chase on the Malazan books of the Fallen. And then, we discuss various other things as well. So.
Yep.
Philip.
Okay.
Yes. Who I will never call Phil ever again.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So before we went live, Matt asked me. It was actually nice of you to ask. Most people don't ask. So yeah. But I actually do not like to be called Phil. And a lot of people just call me that to be friendly. Yeah, I see that. I'm
in Germany, so I think from now on I'll call you Herr Professor Dr. Philip. Herr Professor Dr. Chase. Eigentlich. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
You could go Herr Professor Dr. Fantasy.
Fantasy. Yeah.
Fantasy.
Genau. Yeah.
We could do that, but it would take us all day to get through a conversation. So I've
worked in academia in Germany, and that's exactly what happens. Yeah. Everybody is Herr Professor Dr. Irgendwas. Anyway, introduce yourself.
Okay, I think we should call all each other the entire live stream Herr Professor Doctor. But anyway, I am Philip Chase, and I have a channel all about fantasy, and I also have been, as AP mentioned, doing some wonderful collaborations with some really great people. And the chief one really has been the Malazan Book of the Fallen and Novels of the Malazan Empire with AP. It's been tremendously fun. We've had the opportunity to talk to both Stephen Erickson and Ian Esselmont. Perhaps it might be something to do with the fact that AP is their advanced reader. So that might have something to do with the fact.
I'm one of the people.
One of the advanced readers. Yeah, he is an advanced reader for the two Malazan authors, which is really cool. It's been great fun having a chance to talk to AP about all the books, and we are just about done actually with that collaboration. We have more ahead, but we are soon going to be talking about The Crippled God and A Sail to finish out our Malazan collaboration. So here we are, yeah.
And last but definitely not least, Josh.
Thank you, Paul. Much appreciated, Paul. Thank you. Or the plague.
Well, my name is Josh. I run the channel Red Fury Books. And if my voice is raspy, I just finished a live stream on my channel that I talked for 90 minutes straight, answering questions and all of that. So I'm trying to recoup my voice. So if I'm a little scratchy by the end here, but anyway, it's nice to be here on Matt's channel, and we're just going to talk about books, which is my favorite thing about having my own Booktube channel.
Cool. Let me take a brief moment to fanboy slightly. I didn't even know Booktube existed, I think like 3 or 4 months ago. And I started sort of finding different channels around and whatever. But when I found AP and Phil,
Wait,
I
what happened
thought-
to Herr Professor Doctor?
Herr Professor Dr. Chase.
Thank
When I discovered them, I thought, oh, okay, so people with gray beards also do this. That's cool. And the original idea for this was actually I wanted to do gray beards on books. And because I'm also in the middle of a what I'm calling a Malaz everything read, where I'm rereading the 10 books, but then I'm going into all of the other further books with Esselmont and the Erickson books beyond the 10. I was thinking of doing a Greybeards on books with you two and Iskar Jarak, but he's been a little offline lately. And then I thought, okay, Mike also has a gray beard from Mike's book reviews. I'll invite him, and he's really busy, and it was booked out. And he said, maybe November. So I thought, okay, maybe I'll give up the Greybeards idea and invite somebody else who has read and enjoyed Malazan. And I invited Jimmy Nuts, and he was on the list. He was signed up. He was ready to go. And then he had a family thing that came up sort of short notice. And Josh sprang in at the very last minute, which was awesome.
Josh
so
does have a really good beard too, I want to point out, but he has it shaved at the moment. But
I was going to say, I'm sure it would be at least a little gray.
A little bit,
So-
yeah. I had one earlier this year, and I did have a little bit gray. So I can be part of this group, I think, a little bit.
So I was thinking one of the things, because Josh almost challenged us to, in his live stream, to convince him to read Malazan. So we have a Malazan spoiler-free stream tonight, obviously, because one of our guests has not read it, but he should. And why would you say he should, Herr Professor Dr. Professor Chase?
Why should Josh? Well, obviously to be cool like us.
I don't know if that's possible.
No, I mean, all I can say is that reading this series, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and consequently realizing that I wanted to read it again, and doing so, and reading all of Esselmont's books and Erickson's other Malazan books, has been the greatest literary journey of my entire life. It has been transformative for me. It's been a sublime experience. And I read, among other reasons, I read to make sense of life. I read to feel connected with other people. I read to help me develop, a sense of empathy. I read to challenge myself, to all these things, and to be entertained. And Malazan delivers all those things like nothing else I've ever encountered in my life. So that's what it did for me, and I think it's done it for lots of other people. It's not to say that it's necessarily for everyone. I know people who try it and it's not for them, and that's fine. I have no problems with that. But what it can do for people who get into it is seemingly, I mean, just to tell you that no other author has made me weep nearly as many times as Stephen Erickson has. And it's not tears of sorrow necessarily. It's a mixture of joy and sorrow and everything in between. And it's just such a great thing to do. For me, it has been anyway. So yeah, that's my little pitch. I'm sure AP has some things to say about it too.
So just quickly, can we give this to Erickson? Quote, better than Beowulf. Herr Professor Dr. Chase.
Well,
If
he had written it in Old English, then I could agree with that. Yeah.
Well, certainly longer than Beowulf.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's the quote. Longer than Beowulf.
Well, I've always disliked the question of someone saying, like, why should I read like the Malazan Book of the Fallen, or why should I read that? You go, if you don't want to, then don't do it. I really hate trying to convince someone to read something. Either you want to read something or you don't. Because At the end of the day, if you go into it feeling that I should read this rather than I want to read this, then quite often you aren't in the right frame of mind to really enjoy what's there. But if someone says to you, the Malazan Book of the Fallen is a 10-book series, each book is relatively self-contained within it, with the exception of the last 2 books, which are very heavily connected, almost as a duology. But each book is relatively self-contained, but when you piece them all together, makes a grand narrative. So you don't have to read all of it. You don't have to read it all in one go. That's one way of telling a story, of having a series. But if you compare it to, say, something like Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, which is 3 volumes making up one continuous story, then if that's what you want, then the Malazan Book of the Fallen isn't going to structurally match that. It's a different type of structure. If you like the language of The Lord of the Rings, where the beauty of how Tolkien writes is very evocative, then something like the Malazan Book of the Fallen might interest you, because Erikson uses a very controlled form of writing where quite often the surface level information is only one part of what is going on. There is a lot of subtext to it. There's a lot of implied meaning. And if that is the kind of story that you enjoy, if you like reading short stories where you read it, and then when you read it again, you realize that the author was doing 2 things with it, and then you read it again and go, oh, there's another way of looking at this, that actually there's a depth to the language. If that is the kind of literary experience you want, the Malazan Book of the Fallen does that. If you enjoy military fantasy with soldiers and epic stories and grand battles, that is contained in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but it's not only about that. If you want a very well-defined magic system, then you're not going to get that, because it's not written that way. The Malazan Book of the Fallen, for me, is one of the best fantasy series that has ever been written. The entire Malazan world, created by Esselmont and Erikson together, is an incredibly deep, detailed, well-thought-out reality. But because of that, the actual stories themselves, no matter how tightly controlled, it's messier. It's not following the same narrative conventions of, here are our 12 major characters that you need to know about, and you're going to follow them. And that's it. It's just these 12 major characters. Think of anything that happens in our world, and you go, oh, it was only those 12 people were involved. That is such a heavily simplified form of storytelling that the Malazan Book of the Fallen and a lot of the Malazan works don't follow. They use multiple points of view to challenge preconceptions about what is actually happening on the page. And because you don't get every single point of view, a lot is being placed on the reader. A lot of trust is placed on the reader so that they can immerse themselves and piece it together themselves. And that, to me, is a strength of the writing. But other people go, no, but I want to read to be entertained. I want a story told to me. And then the Malazan Book of the Fallen isn't really going to scratch that itch, because that's not what it has tried to do. So for me, it is a series that delves deep into what fantasy can show us, what fantasy can do in terms of investigating some of the big, big questions about what is humanity. Because the central themes that are evoked in it are not military. They are about friendship. They are about comradeship. They are about different aspects of love and life and grief and loss and death. They are questions about different attitudes and perspectives on life that we bring back then into this world and look at our world with a new light. So, to go to that question then, can you still enjoy them if you don't like military stuff? Yeah, that's only one aspect of it. That it'd be like if you describe The Lord of the Rings, well, do you like quests? The Lord of the Rings then, and it's just like R.A. Salvatore's books. No one says Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is like Icewind Dale, because they are so far apart. About the only thing going for them in similarity is there's a small sort of quest group at the center of it. That's it. But if that's your point of comparison, maybe you would say that, but it doesn't really give a true sense of how like is to like. And the Malazan stuff is it's not focused on the military the same way that, say, the Black Company is, the annals of a military company. But at its heart, there are a lot of soldier characters and how they interact with the world, because a lot of what is being focused on across the entirety of the 10 books is what you come to realize, a world-shaping event. And across the 10 books, when you think of a world-shaping event, military will always be, or is one of the things that is generally involved in that. And so there are a lot of characters who are in the military. But that's what I'd sort of say about it in general.
Well, I kind of planted that seed for Matt to ask that. I'm already planning on reading Malazan.
I knew that.
But I
was playing along nicely, but I did know
a little bit. But
I'm always happy for more people to be talking more about why other people should read Malazan.
Yeah.
Well, I watched a video actually on Joanna's channel, which was the clincher for me, and it was Philip. You were on there with Jimmy and Brittany and Alan.
Oh yeah.
And at the end of the video, she asked, "What do you? Not why should you read it, but who's the series for?" And everyone went around. It was interesting because Alan talked about the military aspects, and Brittany didn't like those aspects, but she liked something different. And then Jimmy talked about something different. Joanna talked about something different. And then Philip, you just said simply that Malazan Book of the Fallen is for people that like great literature. And to be honest, that was the moment I said, okay, I'm going to read Malazan, because that's what I feel I am. I feel that I read a lot of fantasy, but that's not my focus. I read a lot of historical fiction and a lot of literary fiction and a lot of nonfiction. And I feel like this might be a book series that's perfect for me. So I kind of planted that question a little bit, but because I do enjoy, AP, I watched your video about the misconceptions about the Book of the Fallen. And there was so much in there that just made so much sense to me. And I think at least help me frame my expectations going into what the series is going to be like. So where I was originally kind of scared, to be honest, because I see so many people that read the series and can't get through it, or stop after 2 books, or stop after 7 books. I'm actually more excited to start than anything.
Well,
I think
the reason
go ahead, AP.
Sorry, man. I was going to say, the reason I did that video is the number of people who say, I'm intimidated. And you're like, it's just a set of books. You're not intimidated by, the Wheel of Time. Oh, look at all of those pages. You still read them 1 page at a time. You go, oh, but what about the time investment? You go, well, it's still 1 book at a time. Read 1 book. And if you like it, you go, okay. And then you can read another book. Because they go, oh, but it's so many books. You go, but you were going to read books anyway. So I've never understood the whole, oh, there's so much of it. You go, yeah. And if I put back to back all of the books that you've read this year, that's a whole load of books. Oh, it's all in one world. You're like, right? Why does that
It's a really
change the
big
dynamic?
world. It's okay. It's a really big world with a lot of different stuff in it. I mean, I'm rereading it. I've read the 10, and I'm rereading those, and then I'm doing concurrent pub order. So I'm putting in the other bits wherever they go. And what really helped me, I read it in the middle of the pandemic, when I had a pretty rough time, and my woman had disappeared and my job had disappeared within a 2-month period, and it was lockdown. So I basically read all 10 of them back to back in like 2.5 months. I wasn't
like
doing
a
hardly
sort of
anything.
country song. I lost my woman. I lost my job. Yeah. I was locked out in the pandemic, so I read.
Even my
that's
dog.
Where you lose the country audience.
Your dog too?
No, I'm joking. That would be in the country song. No, I didn't and don't have a dog. But yeah, it was a rough period. So I just sat down and I read all of them. And afterwards, I was so wrecked, just because they're extremely emotional, and they do take more effort than a beach read. Yeah, and emotional effort. I was just hearing an echo, I think.
Yeah, it's you.
Yeah, but like 10 seconds delayed from somewhere else. Anyway, when I decided to start the channel, and when I decided to reread the 10 books, I thought, I'm not doing that again. I'm not doing the back-to-back thing. I'm actually going to give myself time to absorb them, and maybe breaks with lighter things in between. And that, so far, that's been working really well. You know, I read one Malazan book and then I read something completely different, usually lighter, easier, quicker. And then I go back to Malazan. And I mean, I love Malazan, but that break, that breathing space actually does help quite a bit. But Josh is already convinced anyway, so we don't have to sell him on it.
We did such a good job. We convinced him before he even got here.
Yeah. We convinced him in the past. We time traveled backwards to convince him.
But I think that's one of the strange things is when we think about why is it that we read? And everyone has a different reason for it. And that reason can actually change on the day. You know, people talk about, oh, I'm a mood reader. I'm in the mood for this. Or I'm in the mood for that. Or they go, you know, I'm a very organized reader. I like to read sequentially and do these things. But we all have different reasons to read. We all find different things entertaining. We all privilege certain experiences. And so sometimes we read and it's a comfort read. We want to read something that is familiar, that doesn't require any effort. And that is absolutely fine. Sometimes we want something that is going to challenge us and make us think. And you go, and that is absolutely fine. Sometimes we want something that is funny. Sometimes we want something that is sad. There's such a breadth to why we read. And like, Matt, you had talked there about, you know, it's more difficult than a beach read. You go, it is, because it's complex in that sense of a lot of information is contained in the text. And so to extract the most from it, you have to expend more energy. And some people just, they're not in the mood for that. And you go, and that's absolutely fine. I think this is probably why I don't like that question of why should I read this? I go, I don't know. I don't know you personally. I don't know what mood you're in. I don't know what it is that you're interested in reading and why you
maybe you shouldn't read it.
And that's, but when Philip had actually said, you know, I wouldn't recommend it for everyone. I can't think of a single book that I have read that I would recommend to everyone that I know. Because books, literature in general, there will always be elements of it that create a resonance for us personally. But there are always going to be people in our lives that you go, well, I wouldn't recommend that to them because I know they don't like that sense of humor. I wouldn't recommend that to them because they're not interested in something that has dragons in it. I wouldn't recommend that to them because they don't like violent stories. That every set of books or every book that we read, there's no one book that has universal appeal and will be loved by everyone. And when we talk about accessibility being a very positive thing, it is making books and text accessible is wonderful. But at the same time, we have to remember that some books are not written for the lowest level of literacy, that some books are written for a higher level of literacy. And we don't criticize them for that, just in the same way that we don't criticize some films that are over 18s, that are R-rated. You don't go, oh, well, they should have toned down the violence and made it accessible to everyone. You go, no, it was made for a more mature audience. And I think that's, sometimes we over-privilege accessibility as this driving influence. This should be available to everyone. You go, there's nothing wrong with appealing to a more niche audience.
And
yeah,
to answer Caitlin's earlier, sorry, Matt.
No, go ahead. Just
to very quickly answer Caitlin's earlier question, yes, there are indeed assassin elves in Malazan. If we take the Teist, particularly the Teist Andi, as the Malazan version of elves, right in the Gardens of the Moon. So, yeah.
That was also like when I started getting into Booktube and I started finding people that were talking about Malazan. That was one of the things I really loved about finding Iskar Jarak is you guys have a very academic, analytical background, and it's amazing listening to you talk about things, and I learn something every time. But then Iskar comes on and he's like, fireballs, explosions, lasers, you know, he's like, Malazan has all of that stuff. And I'm like, okay, so it's well written, and shit explodes. And there are assassin elves. I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm down with all of that. That's great.
Yeah.
It's got something for everyone, is what you can say. It's one of the difficult things in a way. As someone who really loves it, you of course want your people, your friends who like fantasy, you want them to enjoy it. So I think that's where the "you should read it" comes from. I had a conversation the other day with one of my not on the screen friends, and he loves fantasy. We overlap in a lot of places, and I was like, dude, Malazan, you really should try it. And he DNF'd Gardens of the Moon twice already, and he had like such a negative attitude about it, and I was like, okay. It's not for everyone, but yeah, no, I definitely think it's worth it. Okay, we've got some people showing up. Hi, Derry.
That's an interesting point, Matt, actually, that you just made, I think, which is I have an inkling that sometimes it's possible that people who aren't big-time fantasy readers might actually have an easier time with Malazan than people who are big-time fantasy readers.
Yeah.
Because we go into most of our fantasy reads expecting certain tropes, and we expect the narrative to follow along, as AP was saying earlier, with the heroes, with this set of character, the protagonists, what have you, that we identify with, and we go through this whole journey with this small group of people, or with one protagonist. Malazan does something different, and that, I think, can throw a lot of fantasy readers. But what Erickson does in the series isn't unheard of. The lack of hand-holding, for example, that's a feature of literature. That's a choice. That's simply an approach. And it's more common perhaps outside of fantasy than it is inside the genre. So I think a lot of times we fantasy readers, we come to our series with a certain set of expectations. And one issue that I think a lot of people might have, this might be a thing, with Malazan, is they come with these expectations, and when it doesn't fit, they're sort of like, wait, what's going on here? This isn't, where's the hero? So I think that's a thing as well. I don't know, and I don't know if that's your friend's problem or not, Matt, but that's
just talking to him a little bit, it sounded like it was very much that there is not necessarily a story formula, but there is a how you treat the reader formula in a lot of fantasy. Not all of it, of course, but here's a really complex thing that exists in this made-up world. So we're going to have the wise older character explain it to the younger ignorant character so that the reader understands it. Yeah, and that happens a lot in a lot of fantasy books, and it just doesn't happen in Malazan. So there are, occasionally there are bits and pieces where stuff like that, but it gets dropped more like breadcrumbs, like a trail of breadcrumbs that you can follow if you're paying attention, instead of a 5-page info dump by a wise character. Right. And I totally understand it. If that's what you're really used to, where you don't have to follow breadcrumbs, where you don't have to put clues together and make up theories and revise them later because you got more information and so on, then yeah, you may not enjoy it if the other kind of typical fantasy formula is the only kind of thing you enjoy, I don't know.
But if
Mike Gautier says he's on the 3rd book and still doesn't understand much. I would recommend checking out AP and Philip's videos that they've done together, because one of the interesting things about it, having read all 10 books and reading them again now, there is stuff that comes up in the 1st book that may not be fully explained ever, or until the 6th book or the 8th book or the 10th book. There are things I understand about Malazan now that I finished 10 books that I didn't before, and now that I'm rereading them, I'm actually stunned. I'm like, oh, the deck of dragons. I know what it is. I know how it works. There's things in the books that I get now that I didn't before. But it's also, I think of myself as a relatively normal reader. I'm getting maybe a little more conscious and aware and maybe a bit more analytical, but I usually just sort of fly through a book and just sort of enjoy whatever's there, and it goes pretty quickly and I don't think much about it. And
Wait,
doing
Matt, are you
that
saying that AP is not normal?
I wouldn't put it that way, but I'm not his nemesis. Herr Professor Dr. Fantasy.
I hate you, Philip.
It wouldn't be a live stream with the two of you without AP saying, I hate you, Philip. Whispering, I hate you, Philip, into the microphone.
Have we become that predictable?
Well, it's kind of a regular feature.
I think people would be disappointed if it didn't happen.
I would be super disappointed. I would actually probably kick you both off the stream if it didn't happen eventually. So
Well, let me ask a question to Josh. Josh, do you think of yourself as a normal reader? Because I know I think of myself as a normal reader because my experience of reading is limited to me and how I read, and therefore there's that sort of underlying assumption that this is how everyone reads.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. Yeah.
And this is it's a really weird thing. One of the things that happened when Philip and I were having a discussion about Gardens of the Moon, and we talked about something that was in Gardens of the Moon that I thought, now it was in a spoiler discussion of Gardens of the Moon, but I thought was really, really obvious and was fair to include in a Gardens of the Moon spoiler discussion. And it turned out that this particular element that we were discussing is not confirmed until the second book. But all of the evidence is there in Gardens of the Moon. And someone got very, very annoyed at me because they said, but that was a spoiler for the second book. And I'm like, but it's really obvious. And well, it wasn't obvious to me. And you go, how are you meant to know when you read something what is going to be obvious to another person and what is solely obvious to yourself? Because this is one of the perception issues that we have when we read, is that our understanding of the text feels absolutely normal and perfect to ourselves. And to someone else, they might be going, you're saying what? How can you look at this and get that impression? That's really weird. And you go, but no, it makes perfect logical sense, because when we read, what we've created in our mind feels perfectly logical because we are the one creating the meaning. That's how reading works. We create the meaning. But other people's brains do not work the same way. Their experiences are not the same as ours. And therefore, when they read, what they create, which feels absolutely normal to them, could be radically different to what we've read. And that's why when we talk about the reading experience, the personal reading experience, quite often, if you plotted out everything and then did a Venn diagram, the people who are most like us, there's a big overlap in terms of that understanding of the text. There's a massive overlap, but there will still be moments and interpretations of the text that will be individual to that reader. But people who say hate the text that you love, the Venn diagram does not really overlap at all. And it's trying to understand that every reader is bringing their own interpretation to a text, but it still has to flow from the text. And an added complication to this is that we can make mistakes, we can misread, and we can misinterpret, or we can misunderstand something. And that can send our brain creating a pattern in a completely contrary direction that is not actually based in the text, but is based in a misunderstanding of what was on the page. And suddenly then it's harder to match those sort of Venn diagrams of the experience, because ours is now no longer based on a commonality, i.e. the text, but on something completely individual to ourselves that isn't from the text, it's from a misreading.
Derry just put something in the
Derry
comments.
agrees with you. Yeah, I just put it up.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly of this because I was on a discussion and a Discord recently about this. And I was
also in that discussion.
Yeah, I was shocked that people didn't pick it up. I mean, I think I saw it right away. And some people didn't get to the third book until they realized it. It's in Live Ship Traders, but that's very interesting because Your own reading
was-
experience is your own, and I was surprised because I thought it was obvious. Oh, this person is this person, and then just to find that other readers didn't experience it the same way. I mean, that's so right. Her comment just echoes your point there, AP.
The big difference, I think, I mean, I don't know you guys that well, but I'm assuming that with AP and Philip, there's a well exercised analytical muscle that you guys have that I generally don't. That particular, I know exactly the thing that Derry's talking about, and I'm totally with you, Josh. Like, this character appeared, and I was like, oh, that's yeah, okay, I know who that is. And other people were collecting hints, but for me, it wasn't really an analytical thing. I hadn't thought about it. It was just like an intuitive, oh yeah, okay, so that seems to me obvious. I wasn't collecting clues or thinking about it or analyzing anything. It was just like, yeah, okay, I get that. I had actually written down kind of a question, which we sort of got into that area relatively organically. But I often wonder, because for me, reading is mostly relaxation. Like, I read, I don't think hard about what I'm reading until maybe I stop reading, and then afterwards or the next day or whatever, I might start thinking harder about it. But do you guys, with like your analytical literature training and background, are you analyzing while you're reading? To me, that seems like it would take some of the enjoyment out of reading, but maybe it's just a different kind of enjoyment.
Yeah, I think you answered.
Do you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, I'll let you follow, but I think you just answered the question with your final statement, which is to say, it becomes its own pleasure when you practice. It's like with any kind of exercise, with any kind of muscle. You get more pleasure out of it the more you do it, and you get better at it. And so for me, while I'm reading, I am thinking about, is there symbolism going on here? Oh, I like how this flat character is, representative of whatever. Or, oh, I think this is a foreshadowing about, let's see if this is going to happen. And it's kind of fun even to try to predict, oh, is this where the author is going with this? So for me, it enriches the reading experience. And I find that the more these days, as I've practiced and enjoyed that process, I enjoy texts that give me more and more of that. Let's say, like Malazan. Malazan is full of, if you read the epigraphs, you're looking for, okay, what's Erikson going to do with that? And AP and I have taken the time to actually discuss some of the poems that Erikson will lead off a chapter with. And they do have resonance from, hey, Raph. Oh my gosh. All right. There's a story behind that, I'm sure, Raph.
I think Raph's been playing D&D. At least I hope Raph's been playing D&D.
Oh, is that what that is? It's not. That's not.
Waterdeep is in Forgotten Realms.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought he was actually through a chamber pot at some poor guy. So.
Yeah. I don't know how he got to Waterdeep unless he was.
I won't ask if there was anything in the chamber pot or not. But anyway, so for me, Matt, yeah, you answered the question, which is it's its own pleasure, I think. And the more you do it, the more fun it gets. But I don't know. What do you think, AP?
Well, to add to that, there's an analogy that might be helpful. When you first learned to drive, and you got onto the freeway or the highway, and you're very, very tense, and you're looking there and you're looking there, and you're having to do everything very, very actively. You have to focus, you have to concentrate, and it can be exhausting. And then you think of, once you've been driving for 20 years, you're on the freeway, and you automatically, like, you're sitting having a conversation with someone, and you slow down, and the reason you slowed down was you picked up that someone a couple of cars ahead of you in the other lane you just got a sense that they were about to change lane. They were going to pull into the lane in front of you. So you slowed down to make sure there was a gap there so you wouldn't have to slam on your brakes. And the thing is, it's because you're so experienced at it that you're doing things reflexively. You're doing them unconsciously. So the more that you, and when we first started to learn to read, when you were mouthing out the letters and the sounds to try and put the words together, and then forming the whole word, and then the whole sentence, and then reading the whole sentence back, that, we start out that way, and then we get better at it. We practice. Both of those sorts of things sort of combine, so that the more that you practice this sort of active reading, where you are sort of paying attention to it, the more it becomes reflexive, and you do it without knowing that it's almost like in the back of your head, you're noting down as you are reading a passage about how the author has chosen this point of view, and this point of view is written in a certain style, and it's using a certain sort of typology of the words that are being chosen are fitting into a certain lexicon. And that is actually going to the characterization. And that then means that this character has this sort of background, or is thinking about things this way. And all of this information is just sort of unconsciously being registered as you're reading. And it's only when you have to explain it to someone else that suddenly you realize how difficult it is to unpack all of this and how much you have to explain. And that's why I can take a video, or I can make a video of a single paragraph that takes you fewer than 30 seconds to read, but it'll take me 10 minutes to explain everything that's going on in it, because I'm trying to explain all of the different sort of techniques and choices, but for a range of different levels of understanding. Because I could have gone, yeah, so clearly you can see it means this. Full stop, end of video. I could put it up as a YouTube short. Or I go, right, well, not everyone is going to have that experience. I'll go through it sort of point by point to slowly build it out. But explaining something always takes longer. And when you become practiced at it, think of the next time that you're driving. If you had to explain to your passenger what you're doing at every second while you're driving, well, I'm monitoring the speed that I'm going here, and I'm keeping an eye on that. And I've just taken my foot off the gas because I'm dropping this down, and I'm going to change gear here and indicate, and I'm checking the mirror. And it becomes exhausting when you think of all of the things that you're doing automatically. But because you're so practiced at it, it's not exhausting. You've developed that muscle memory, that technique, that ability, that skill. Reading is exactly the same thing. And yes, obviously you get an advantage when you have spent time at university studying it, because lecturers have spent time teaching you all of the techniques, which everyone can learn. Everyone can learn these techniques, and you can learn them just by reading. It just requires more effort, and it's a shortcut to have someone teach you.
It's like any activity where you need practice. Like Josh, I'm sure running 10 miles is a pleasure for you, but for most
this morning,
yeah. So for most people, running 10 miles would be torture, but you love it.
Running
because
10 miles would kill me. Fuck that.
But see, it's just like anything. So yeah, I mean, it absolutely is just a matter of, if you want to do it and you want to get good at it, just start doing it.
I'm actually, I was just starting to think in my own head that I think how I read has already changed, even though I've only really been paying attention to anyone on Booktube for a few months. I'm interested with you, Josh, because you've been doing it a lot longer. I was kind of consciously leaning on the PhDs to just let them talk, because I know that they're really good at it. And I knew that you needed a break, but you've had a break now. So
true.
how is your reading changed since you started listening to YouTube booktubers and running a channel yourself?
I'd say one of the things, I think I am a little more conscious when I am reading things than I used to be. I think I used to be just 100%, well, not 100%, because I've had a Goodreads profile and I've done reviews on there for at least 10, 15 years. So I was always somewhat conscious about what I was reading, but I think I'm a lot more aware about what I'm reading beyond normal plot and character points, which might have been my focus when I was, not doing this sort of thing. I think that I tend to pick up on theme a lot better than I used to. And I think I am a lot better at identifying subtext of things as well. And I think part of that is just thinking about as I'm reading, but usually it's afterwards, not necessarily as I'm in the act of it, but the next day or the next morning, like when I'm going on a run and I'm thinking about what I read the night before, I often think about what it is that I read, what that meant, what this informs, what I think is going to happen next. What is the author trying to say? What's the author's intent with this? So I think that I'm a lot more just aware. And, Philip, when you were talking about how for you it's fun because you've had this training and this is part of what you do, it brought me back to being, I'm a musician with a couple music degrees and I've taught 20 plus years. And for me, it's a lot of times I'm doing the same thing when I'm listening to a piece of music is I'm analyzing it. Yeah. And that doesn't make it less fun than when I was 14 and just listening to it. I'm a lot more educated, and that's part of the fun is understanding, oh, well, the composer did this here and then did this here. That's just so clever. And for me, it just enriches my appreciation for what they did. And I'm still learning that for literature because I don't have any training beyond just reading a whole hell of a lot every year. But I think I am definitely a lot more conscious about what I'm doing when I'm reading, knowing that at a bare minimum, I do a monthly wrap up where I talk about all my books. At a bare minimum, I need to be able to talk about a book somewhat coherently for a couple minutes. So I have to be able to, expand upon my feelings in that manner.
But the point you just raised there about music is actually a really, really good one, because if you think reading music, so either with the treble clef or a bass clef, but if you're reading the notes on the page, the annotations, when you first do that, it's almost like you recognize the positions and you in your head go, that's an A, that's a C, that's an F sharp. But a lot of the people that I know who specialize in music, they don't even do that anymore. They hear the music, they hear what the note is as they are reading, and that was something I could never learn. I just had to memorize the notations, but they would actually just look at it and they could hear how it was meant to sound. That was a skill that they developed. And reading literature is the same. It is exactly the same thing when you start getting into the technical sort of aspects of it and how it is put together. So if you think of a work by a composer where they've put together a symphony and you have what the strings are doing, what the brass is doing, what the percussion is doing, and trying to put all of this together, everyone in the audience can sit and listen to it and appreciate it and enjoy it. And then some people in the audience will be able to, oh, that's a riff on what so-and-so did in their symphony, and this is the answer that this composer was doing. Someone else is there going, oh, I really like how there's a different theme and tone being worked in. We all have different appreciations and different ways of appreciating it, which is absolutely fine. The whole point is art of all kinds is there for us to enjoy, but we do have different forms of enjoyment. And a lot of it depends on our skill with understanding that particular art. And pointing out that on a journey to understand art, there is no final point. There is no point where you get to and go, oh, I am now a qualified reader. No, that point never happens. It is a constant evolution. And no matter how much I read, no matter how much I study this stuff, there is always more to learn. There are always people I turn to and say, I don't understand this. Can you explain it to me? And there's no shame in that. And I've always been slightly frustrated when people sort of get very defensive about, well, I don't know this, and therefore I'm just not going to learn it. This is, and part of it is I love literature so much. I want to know it all. I want to experience it all. I want to understand it all. And any opportunity I have to learn from people who know more than me, I always try to take, because I want to get better at it. And it opens up so many different books and texts and techniques the more that I know. And that's one of the things that I'm so passionate about in terms of how narrative is used to enrich our lives, to tell us things that can influence us.
I just dropped
No,
out.
everyone's quiet.
Yeah. I'm curious also, not only how does reading more or running a booktube channel change how you read, but how Professor Chase you're writing a lot. I don't know if the other two. I think I've heard Josh say he doesn't write. I'm not sure. Yeah. Do you write at all, AP? I know you work as an editor, but I mean, do you write your own original stuff?
No.
Okay. So, question for Herr Professor Dr. Chase. How has writing changed how you read?
That's actually a really great question. I think there's a wonderful relationship between, for me anyway, the way I experience it, between writing and reading. And in some ways, what comes out of me when I'm writing is not entirely, but in to some degree, a product of the books that I've read and that I've consumed and the knowledge I've gained from them. And I'm not meaning just fiction necessarily. There's plenty of nonfiction that's made its way into my books too. This is why a lot of great writers will tell you, you need to read and read broadly. If you want to write fantasy, read lots of fantasy, sure, but don't just read fantasy. Read nonfiction, read other genres, read, because you never know how that stuff will come out in your writing. And so, I've read some philosophy that has informed my writing, particularly Buddhist philosophy, or I've read myths from around the world that have made their way into what I'm trying to do in my writing. And so, as a writer, and going in the other direction, I think it's just like, it's a lot like being a teacher, and I'm sure Josh can relate to this. I know AP can. When you have to teach something, you really understand it. I don't think there are many things that I really understood very well until I started to teach them, and having to explain them to other people and help them understand the topic at hand really makes you get a grasp on it yourself. And writing is similar, I think. So when you try writing and you realize, oh, okay, I see this technique, I'm trying to do it here, and it's harder than I thought, and then you notice it more when you're reading. You notice, oh, this author really pulled this off really well here, this particular technique. You tend to be a much more, just like, with the academic training, I think trying to write teaches you to be a little bit more aware as a reader as well. I think the two feed in. For me, I can't separate what I do at work, I'm an English professor, from what I do on YouTube, where I talk about books in the same way I would in the classroom, and from my own writing, which has gained a lot from both teaching and from being here on YouTube, talking to really cool, lovely people like you three and the people in the chat. So yeah, it all, for me, it's all just sort of one wonderful cauldron.
Joanna's point in the comments is right on for me about the brain activity with teaching. And I know, Philip, you've talked about this as well, because I just mentioned it on my live stream. I think I was talking about book characters, but I think even human beings, we have our own core, or one core value or two core values that are at the heart of who we are as an individual. And for me, I'm a learner. And that's why I love teaching, because in addition, yes, I'm teaching my students and they're learning from me. I'm learning from them. I'm learning how to be a better teacher. I'm learning how to be a more effective communicator. And I learn every day that I teach. And it's very true. I mean, that point that you just put up on the screen there, it is true, because I feel like I've grown so much as a musician teaching, even though, a conductor doesn't make a sound with a baton. I feel like that I can make music better now than I did maybe ever my whole life.
Wow. Josh, I just out of curiosity, do you write music too?
I do not. I sometimes arrange music for my students, but yeah.
There was an interesting thing of one of the concepts in narratology involves diegetic levels. And this is going to be a tiny bit of digression, but it's a way
from
of
you, AP? I don't believe it.
Don't worry, there will be a point of connection.
I'm sure there will.
Part of it is when you start thinking about text in terms of diegetic levels, it makes you aware very much of information that is internal to a text and information that is external. And so even understanding the concept of the diegesis and the idea that you can have different levels of information, as soon as you unlock that concept, it starts to make you think very much about where you're getting the information from and how you're interpreting it, which actually is an entirely different school of literary analysis, which much more involved in reader response theory and semiotics and semantics and that whole aspect. Whereas narratology and this whole idea of diegetic levels and the diegesis, and that's structuralism. And there's cross-pollination between these different things. But when we think about a diegetic level, we say, if this is the main level that the story is functioning on, so when Frodo is speaking to Sam, that is happening on the diegetic level. But if Frodo, in speaking to Sam, then tells a story, so Frodo tells Sam the story of Beren and Luthien. And so we have a section of that story being recounted. That's a story within a story. And we go, so it's not, when we read that Beren then went to Luthien, it's not happening at the same level of Sam and Frodo. So we drop it down a level and we can now imagine the action actually happening. We imagine Beren walking to Luthien, but we're not imagining it in the same narrative space that Frodo is talking to Sam, because he is telling a story and we recognize that. So we realize that we're creating these different spaces, narrative levels, in and around a narrative. And one of the things that trying to explain that to someone helps you consolidate that concept in your mind, because you can naturally sort of, oh, I get a sense of what you're talking about. But then if you try to explain that to someone else and you don't know what you're talking about, or you haven't got a truly firm grasp on it, you go, it's kind of like that thing where, and it's very hard to express. And I think this is the point that we were just discussing there, that when you teach something, in order to teach it, you have to know it better. And as you teach it, as you see the questions coming back of, I'm not following your chain of thought, that you then have to think of another way to do it, which means that you spin that knowledge in your mind, you come at it from a different angle, so you know it even better. So there's a constant feedback loop of you gaining greater understanding of the concept that you're trying to teach, and also find more effective ways to communicate that to other people. And because of that, you actually become more and more aware that other people do not sense things and understand things the same way that you do, which calls into question then a lot of our perceptions of, when we read a scene and we go, it is clearly means this. This is what happens in this scene. And someone else will go, what are you talking about? It's entirely different. And so you have to become very, very flexible about thinking about the construct of a scene or what is happening on the page from different perspectives. And that flexibility, it's not a matter of imagination in terms of, can you visualize the scene? It's imagination in trying to reprocess the information with a different set of criteria and a different set of biases and filters. And in literary studies, this is something you're taught to do from a very early stage, because you can apply like a feminist critical lens to a text, and you basically you get a whole set of assumptions that are part of feminist literary theory, and you're using that as a lens to filter the text. And then you take it away and the text resumes its normal shape. You use post-colonial theory for much the same way, as a way of trying to reanalyze and recontextualize the information. So you become very, very flexible with approaching the information in the text as not a simple data set of, it's just words that have only one meaning. You start to think about it much more in terms of something that is flexible and interpretive.
Yeah, AP, the whole time you were talking, I was thinking that's why empathy is essential to being, I think, a good teacher. Would you agree with that, Josh? Do you think?
That, without a doubt, yeah.
Well, Josh, let me ask you a question. When I think for some people, when we talk about reading, and you go, but the text is just the text. So if you take a piece of music, one of the concertos, and you go, oh, so it just sounds like, and you can have it replicated by a synthesizer playing those sounds. And then you go, right, now let's hear Yo-Yo Ma play it, or let's hear this person play it. You go, each of them will play it differently. You go, but how can it be different? It's the same set of notes set to the same rhythm. So what is changing in that? Like, how would you explain that?
Yeah.
Well, there's levels of artistry that are inherent in different performers that you can't replicate on a page. I mean, they have modern technologies now that you can have MIDI instruments, digital instruments that'll sound exactly like, an acoustical instrument. It's amazing some of the things you can hear. In fact, you probably hear it on television and movies all the time where it's not necessarily a live orchestra, but there's just something intangible that's a level of artistry there that you can't, it's really hard to explain it. I mean, it's kind of like I was trying to explain to a friend. So I finally have one friend in real life that's read Robin Hobb, who's my current favorite fantasy author. But I have lots of people on YouTube, and that's why I love, Booktube, is because I can talk with Robin Hobb about people. I was trying to explain to him what it is I love about Robin Hobb's prose, and I didn't have the words to explain it. And I sometimes feel like that even with music as well. Now I can analyze a phrase and give you 5 different cellist things. And I can say, well, here's what this person did. Here's what this person did. Here's what this person did. But to equivocally say that this is how one person produces music a superior way, it's more of an art than a science. There's no like firm answer there. And maybe that's why I couldn't explain Robin Hobb, or I just lack the literary terminology to be able to say why she's amazing to me.
But let me ask you this. Could you explain the difference between sort of, good cello performance against bad cello performance if one of them was Yo-Yo Ma and the other was a first-year cellist playing the same piece?
Without a doubt. Oh, yeah.
So the difficulty actually in a lot of this, one of the reasons we find it difficult when it comes to the literature that we talk about, is we have to remember that the literature we're talking about is the published works. That these are not the scribblings of someone who has just started. This is someone who has practiced and practiced and practiced and gotten their book published. That we're already talking about people at the sort of the upper echelons of writing. And so trying to differentiate between 5 great cellists or 5 great violinists, that's going to be more difficult than one great violinist and people who have only been holding a violin for 2 weeks. That you could easily tell the difference between those. So it's not just that, oh, well, it's all just subjective and it's all just airy-fairy sort of art and feelings. There are actual objective measures that it's very easy to point to. But when you get down to differentiating between the best examples that we have in the genre, that is you're talking about the differences between some of the best writers. And that differentiation is so difficult to do because it's trying to decide who's the best writer when everyone is getting 99.99 out of 100 in an exam. Oh, well, we'll go down to the 3rd decimal point to try and rank them. So, I mean, I think sometimes that's the difficulty, that the books that we talk about and that we love tend to be some of the best examples. And that's why it can be so difficult to parse them, to get to those differences.
I think you can, though, articulate as a reader a particular impact that a text has had on you. The same way you can when you sit. I have had the privilege of listening to a live concert with Yo-Yo Ma playing one of the Bach cello solo suites. And I've been to a lot of cello recitals because both of my daughters are cellists. And I love going to the recitals, but they don't have the same emotional impact that listening to Yo-Yo Ma play has. I mean, these kids are learning and total respect for that. It's a difficult instrument. But there are things that Yo-Yo Ma does really, really well. And you can talk about, intonation and rhythm, and you would be much better at it than I am, Josh. And so it's similar, I think, with books. You know, you can articulate, why did Robin Hobb have this impact on you? Well, you felt immersed in her story. Why? Well, because the characters, we like to talk about characters a lot, right? So the characters have had a tremendous impact on you. Why? What did Robin Hobb do to make those characters? Well, in the Farseer trilogy, you've got Fitz telling his story, and he's an older person looking back on this younger person, and you're the reader and you're hearing this older person looking back on this younger person with a sense of pain, with a sense of experience, with a sense of sympathy for this poor young person as the young person is learning. So there you go. There's a technique. Or how many, father figures do you have, or parental figures in there? And what's the emotional impact? Because we all have parental figures in our lives. And so you can articulate these things, And I think that, again, it's just a matter of practice. You get better and better at it. But it is a struggle sometimes to just pinpoint, okay, this is why the book had such an impact on me. But it's fun to try.
And also that movement from the surface level specific into more abstract or generalized concepts, that is one of the techniques to be really, really aware of. Because I recently watched the film RRR, which is an Indian film. And I know very little about the history of India. It wasn't something I'd studied. But it dealt with two famous sort of freedom fighters who were fighting for Indian independence. And it's set in the 1920s. And Indian independence from the British Empire. And you can take the concepts of that, even if you know nothing about Indian history, and you can go and look it up and become more versed in it. But you can also think about it more generally of, well, okay, instead of looking at it as the British and the Indian Empire, let's think about it as an empire and a different state that is under colonial power. Oh, that gives me a more generalized notion, a more abstract notion of the power dynamic, and understanding power dynamics gives me a way in to understand that. And then when you think about the idea of power dynamics, you can then apply that in relationships. So father to son, brother to brother, that thinking about the dynamics between things, we can actually then make comparisons between governmental structures and relationships between characters. And suddenly, as soon as you start doing that, you realize that you're breaking apart the text into these concepts and then understanding how the concepts fit together. And of course, as someone who likes structuralism, as someone who likes narratology, this is something I practice a lot and I quite enjoy doing, and not everyone does. But it gives you a different way of appreciating how things are moving and what the tensions are within a text. And then you can go the opposite way and use a completely different technique of close reading, of paying really particular attention to the very specific word choice on the page and thinking about the very specific connotations. And that approach is antithetical to structuralism, is antithetical to what I was just describing. And yet that can give you a massive insight into how things are happening on the page. So by combining those two different techniques, and usually you do it with two separate passes, you look for structural things in one pass and you look for the close reading things in a different pass, because it's hard to do both at the same time. But by combining both those techniques, you gain a greater appreciation for what's on the page. And then when you start applying other critical lenses to understand things, you get so much more from the text. And because you understand more of the text, because you understand more of what's there, you can sometimes understand why you personally responded to certain things better. It gives us additional tools with which not only to understand the text, but to understand how we read and how texts affect us. And even better than that, when texts don't, when we are reading something and we're not enjoying it, it can actually help us find what it is about the text that we aren't enjoying. Because initially we'll go, oh, it's because it's badly written. And that's generally said by people who don't understand what the difference in good writing and bad writing. It's if you don't like it, it's bad. It's the same thing that we say when we're children. We don't like the taste of something. Oh, that's bad because you don't like it. And, that's where we all start. But if you understand how to pick a text apart, you can find out, is it because it was written in first person present tense? Is it because it was creating this impression of the character, but the text was running counter to that? That you start understanding your relationship to the text. And you do that by understanding the text better, and that helps you understand yourself better, and therefore it all comes together to help you understand the relationship better.
This morning, or actually over the last couple of days, I just recently started a new book. If you want to hunt for it, you can probably find it, but I'm not going to right now diss any author. But I was reading it, and I had my knee-jerk, I guess, like you just said, AP, childish reaction. I was like, this is not good. This kind of sucks at the beginning of the book. And I guess because I've been paying so much attention to books and listening to your videos and other people's videos and trying to come up with a way to explain why I like a book, because I'm doing reviews, my knee-jerk reaction to my knee-jerk reaction was, yeah, that's not really good enough anymore. Just saying, this sucks. So I stopped and I reread the passage. I was like, okay, and I'm taking baby steps. I don't have these analytical muscles very well exercised yet, but I really, it's something to be honest, that I've kind of always avoided, and I think maybe a lot of readers do, because it feels like you're not reading. It feels like you're interrupting your reading. And especially at the beginning, we were already talking about, like, you need to practice it, and just like driving, it's conscious at the beginning and whatever. But it feels like I'm losing time where I want to just be flowing in the story and just enjoying myself, and and having to stop and go, okay, let's start putting my thoughts together in some sort of a structured, coherent way. It doesn't feel like reading. At first, it feels like work.
I think there's a sacrifice in a way that you make when you decide, okay, I'm going to analyze this book as I read it or after I read it, and it does take time. I consider myself to be, relative to most people on this platform, a pretty slow reader, because I'm taking time to pause and say, wow, why does this sentence work so well for me? What's going on here? Or I'm thinking about the stuff we've been talking about. I'm thinking about the narrative perspective, or I'm trying to analyze the characters and their motives, or I'm looking at the setting and trying to understand where the real world influences are here. Whatever. It takes me longer to read because I do that. And I would venture to say that when you do that, the story tends to stick with you, probably in most cases a little bit better than when you're just reading for the plot, when you're just reading to get through the book. And we kind of have to do that if we're going to talk about books here on this platform. We have to think about them. And I think it's great that we make videos and have discussions about books, because they stick with us better. It's just like, again, the teaching thing, where if you have to teach something, you really do have to learn it. And it's similar, I think, when we discuss books. And it's going to take you longer if you're seriously going to try to have a meaningful discussion about what's going on in the book.
But you don't have to. And that's the thing.
You don't have to.
We can still...
You do have to if you want to try and make a review of what you're reading.
No, but even then, there are different types of review. You can have a very text-centric review, or you can have one that is focused very much on the reader experience, an experiential type of review, where you're talking about your personal response to a text. And everyone is qualified and should be encouraged to engage with literature, to engage with their reading response. Everyone can do that from the very beginning, from when they are reading. And that is always a good thing. But it's to be aware, and this is the thing that sometimes is difficult to understand. Just because that's our experience doesn't mean that it is going to be true for everyone, or B, even an accurate depiction of what the book is, because we don't want to confuse our preferences for evaluative criteria about the quality of the work, because our preferences are going to be personal. And so how you structure the review, how you talk about it, how you express these things, by all means, like, bring in how you felt. I love this character. This character was so amazing because, explain your reasoning. Because if I know what your reasoning is for why you love the character, then I can go, oh yeah, but that's the kind of character that sets my teeth on edge. Maybe I want to avoid that book. But you can talk about all of these things from a deeply personal point of view without any of the academic or critical language or any of these analytical tools. You can have very meaningful conversations, but it's just to be aware that there is a difference between these approaches, and they're focused on different things, and they are bringing to light different elements. And when we talk about Philip and I, discussing theme and subtext, these are things that are much easier to highlight and understand the more you are used to the analytical mode, and when you do it reflexively, because it's just a muscle memory of going, oh yeah, I'll look at the power dynamics here because that's going to correspond to that, and of course that's mirroring that thing over there, and let's look at, oh well, that character, their journey is the inverse of that character, so let's put those two in conversation, and oh, lo and behold, I now have a whole video I can talk about. That people can do that without the training that Philip and I have had the privilege of having. But I think it comes slightly easier to us because we had that training. But you can still do it. You can still engage. You don't need the training to do it. And the last point I would say on this is, even if you want to get better at this type of reading, if you're not enjoying it, if it's making your life miserable, is the gain really worth it? Because you don't have to. No one is forcing you to. But if this is something that you genuinely want, then yeah, it's like any sort of exercise or learning any sort of skill that you have to work at it first. It's the question of, do you want to do that? And I can't imagine going back to not being able to read books the way that I do now. I love that I have all of these different academic and critical tools at my disposal when I read. It makes my reading experience so much more enjoyable for the books that I love. And even books that I have problems with aspects of them, I actually enjoy other parts of it even better because I understand how it's working, or I understand a bit of it that I didn't like, and I go, but I can see what they were doing, and that's fine. It's that technique. I know I don't particularly enjoy that technique, but it takes some of the sting out of the negative and can greatly enhance the positive. And that's how it is for me personally. I would not want to go back to how I used to be, where I was just reading and didn't really know why certain books were appealing to me or why I didn't like other books. But if it is miserable and it feels too much like work and it feels too much like homework, then just read, do the thing, and engage in reading the way that makes you happy, because happiness is really, really important, particularly in this day and age when everything around us seems to be crumbling into despair. Take joy in the things that you can take joy in, and don't worry about all of the other stuff.
I think AP made a really good point about the different review styles, because I know, Matt, you're just getting started with the way that you do things. There really is a big spectrum. And I think, you do have the one end of the spectrum where a reviewer will be very analytical and talk about theme and a lot of, deeper things about it. And then you'll have the other spectrum of the reviewers that may only talk about plot and how it felt to them. And I just think about all the YouTube channels that I follow, and I like people in all the spectrum there. There's some that don't give me much depth, but I love their enthusiasm when they're talking about a book. Mm-hmm. And then I see, Philip gives a review and there's so much depth in there, and there's a lot of theme and a lot of things that make me connect with it. And I love that as well. So I think, Matt, it's just a matter, and I'm doing the same thing myself, just finding where we fit in that spectrum as far as what we want to do and what we want to talk about. But like AP, your last point, as far as the enjoyment, I see, like, I know that some like book reviewers, I see their books and they have all these tabs and all these things and they take all these notes. And I never want to do that because I want to enjoy it. I want to obviously be able to talk intelligently about it, but this is a hobby that I love and I don't want it to feel like homework. So that's kind of my approach, at least.
But when I was starting notes that way.
No, when I was starting looking at Booktube channels, I discovered, I think the first person I ran into Malazan content related was Iskar. And he's done some really, like, he's done videos on like chapter by chapter, but he also doesn't have the academic background. So a lot of what he was saying was, oh man, this was so cool. And it blew up there and there was a big fight there and, you know, that kind of thing. And it wasn't so much analyzing the prose or the style or anything like that, which was great. And it actually reawakened my love of the Malazan books and made me want to reread them. And then I was really, I was really blown away when I discovered, I think it was Herr Professor Dr. Chase first. And then there was a live chat like this one. And I think it was you and Iskar, or maybe it was the three of you with AP as well, at some point. And I was like, oh, okay. So not only have you got the really analytical, deep, getting into all the nooks and crannies of a book, but you've also got the lasers and fireballs, and they get along. That's really cool.
Good buddies.
That was really exciting to me, is seeing the community of people with extremely different approaches and levels of maybe education or analytical muscle development or whatever, all getting together and enjoying the same books and enjoying talking about them. Yeah.
But there's one aspect, actually, if you want to talk about reviewing, that I think is very important that we tend to forget about, is who is your review for? Because when you are writing a review, when you're recording a review, if you're going to do a video, you have an imagined audience. And whether you have consciously created that, you have an unconscious imagined audience, because clearly it's not for absolutely everyone. That you have in your head an idea of who you're talking to. Because if you were talking to someone and you're going to review a fantasy book and your idea is, well, no one who watches my channel has read fantasy before, how you would structure that review would be very, very different, because you'd start out by explaining what fantasy is if you imagine that your audience does not know what fantasy is. If you imagine that your audience does know what fantasy is, then you've imagined an audience that has a certain knowledge of fantasy. So you see how even with something as basic as that, that will affect and alter how you structure your review. If you assume that the people who are watching your review, let's say of Gardens of the Moon, are likely to have heard of Sanderson or heard of Tolkien, you might use Sanderson or Tolkien or Robert Jordan or George R.R. Martin or Johnny Wirtz or Robin Hobb as points of comparison to Erickson or to Esselmont. That you assume a base knowledge. You're assuming other texts that they may have read, or a range of texts that they may have read. So you're making a lot of assumptions about your readership. And thinking about who your audience is and what you're trying to tell them can actually really impact how you shape and style your reviews, because it makes you think about what you're trying to communicate and what the most effective way to communicate that to your intended audience is.
Yeah. I'm curious, Josh, if you don't mind talking about it, how are you going to engage with the Malazan series? Are you intending to do reviews or discussions, or what have you got planned for that?
Definitely discussions, because there's a little cohort involved, which is apparently a not so well kept secret. But yeah, there are a cohort of ours that we're going to be reading it together and having a discussion about each book. As far as reviews, I'm not sure if I'll just do the discussions at all. The one thing is, I have told myself every year I make a goal for books. And my goal next year is I want to read less books, because I do want to kind of slow down and kind of savor a little bit more. I've done that a bit this year. Like, I read my Robin Hobb books a lot slower than the others because I just love being immersed in her writing. So I'm going to try to be picking more books like that next year. So, I'm probably going to read 130 this year. I may only read 80 or 90 next year, and I'm fine with that. But as far as, yeah, my
TV only 80 or 90.
But, as far as Malazan, that's the one thing, because I know that a lot of readers have, lost the series for various reasons. I'm going to be very conscious in the fact that I want to make sure I'm paying attention and not worrying about rereading paragraphs or chapters or even part of a book again if I feel that I'm not understanding as I go along. Mm-hmm. I know you've given the advice to go with the flow, and I'll try to do that as much as I can, but I'm the kind of person that I don't know how well that'll work for me. So I think I'm not saying I won't give individual book reviews. I know I'll read them differently and I'll have the discussions, but beyond that, I'm not 100% sure yet.
Yeah. About the go with the flow thing, maybe one possible strategy is to not interrupt yourself while you're reading, but once you're done reading, to then go consult the map or go online to answer your question or ask somebody. But because I constantly, my first time reading the series, was interrupting myself. And when you do that, you're pulling yourself out of the story. You're pulling yourself out of the world, which doesn't help the immersion. So I think it's fine to want to figure things out. And, that's great. And you won't, AP and I both, will say that there are many aspects to the series we still haven't figured out that we miss when we talk about so many things, when we talk about the books. So it's a really great problem in a way to have this wealth of things going on in a series that you can probably reread. It'll support multiple rereads and analyses, and people probably have written dissertations on that series. So, yeah.
And one of the things I find really helpful with it too is that there's an excellent community in lots of different places.
Yeah.
I made the mistake when I had my pandemic 10 very big books read. I didn't really have a community. I wasn't in contact with anybody else who'd read it. So the thing I was doing is I was checking the wiki. And I figured out that a number of characters died before they actually died in the books where I was. So I was like, yeah, okay. So I can't depend on the wiki. I just have to go alone and just read. But knowing what I know now, if I was to read Malazan for the first time now, I would be leaning on videos like AP and Philip and Iskar Jarak and many other people have done. I'd be getting on the Discords and talking to people like me and them who've read the books and thought about them a bit already. And the other thing that I've found that's great about the Malazan community is, well, in general, the Booktube community is people are very conscious of spoilers. Except what AP was talking about earlier. Sometimes you don't realize a spoiler is a spoiler, but generally people are very much like, okay, where exactly are you in that book? And what has just happened? And we'll keep things to a point where they're not going to ruin anything for you. But it definitely helps having the discussions, or even just listening to recorded discussions that are already out there. Because it is complex, and there are a lot of, for me, being not a super conscious reader, there are so many things that I flew over in Malazan, and I just thought, and then 5 pages later, I was like, I don't understand what's going on. I think maybe I missed something. And it turns out I flew over it too quickly, because I was doing what Philip said. I was just going with the flow, and I'm getting a lot of, it's a totally different read with my reread. There is so much more I'm getting out of it because I know things that I didn't know the first time I read it, of course. but there is so much depth in it, and there is so much going on that the community and the discussions really, really help a lot.
Raph says that he reads Malazan completely blind.
You can always count on Raph for a good blind joke, can't you?
Yeah. And apparently we're a very sexy panel, according to Ruth and Bad.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Well, one of the interesting things that sort of comes up, particularly in relation to talk about like books on YouTube and like the speed at which you read, the number of books that you read. It's nice every once in a while to slow down and think more about what you're getting out of reading, not just the consumption of more and more greater and greater numbers of narratives, but to slowing down and gaining greater depth and appreciation of a smaller number of narratives. I mean, when I think of when a friend of mine spends, a week reading a single slim volume of poetry, and they've spent hours going over these poems and rereading the poems and then thinking about the poems and then going back, you go, oh, have they wasted this week? Just you could read 10 volumes of poetry in that time. You go, yeah, but you haven't engaged with it. You've just consumed it. And I'm not saying everyone should do that, but there is value in not looking at the number of books you are reading in a year and thinking about it in terms of, was it time well spent? Do you want to plow through as many as possible, or maybe take longer, slow down your reading to engage more with that book, to give that book time to resonate, to give yourself time where you've finished a chapter and go, instead of moving on to the next chapter, let's think about this chapter for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe flick back and have a look at something in it. And I know that is antithetical very much to the prevailing attitude that we have. We want the next TV episode. We want all the TV episodes of the season out at the same time so we can binge it. We want the next film out right away so we can watch it. We want, oh, you've written book 1 of a series? Well, write the rest of the series so I can read them all in one go and I don't have to wait. We've encouraged and become addicted to instantaneous gratification, that we need this and we need to plow through and consume as much as possible. And I think learning to slow down and chew our food a bit more actually benefits us, because we can appreciate that work better than simply consigning it to the dustbin of, this is a book I have read and I vaguely remember the main plot point, which is quite often what happens when we speed read. We get the surface topography of the narrative events. We get the surface outer layer of characters, but we don't get their interiority. We don't get the complexity of the work because we are bulldozing through it so quickly to get that done, to move on to the next one. And it is very difficult to learn to slow down because we feel pressure to do things faster. We feel pressure. Oh, my Goodreads target was 200 books this year and I'm 10 off. Well, next year, I did 200 last year. I'll do 210 this year. And the year after, everything is always about, well, they did 200. I'm going to do 300. And then it's, well, I'm going to change what a book is. Now, every single comic book is now counting as a single volume book because I need to make the numbers bigger. And even like the whole argument about listening to an audiobook is the same as reading. You go, they are equally valuable, but it's not the same as reading. Reading is when a reader interprets the text and there's nothing between them. Listening to an audiobook, you're listening to a performance of the text, which is an interpretation of the text.
There, you heard it. AP hates audiobooks.
And
Which
Josh, as
you should take this personally, Raph. AP basically hates you.
yeah,
Apparently.
oh yeah, I hate Ralph. He knows that. We've talked before. But it's not to say that listening to an audiobook has no value. Of course it has value. It is a different way of consuming and engaging with the narrative. But there's a performative element to it that makes it different to reading. And you can read with your eyes, you can read with Braille, as long as there's nothing between the reader and the text. But if you're listening to a performance, acknowledging that the performance will have an effect means that you're acknowledging there is a difference. if you're acknowledging there's a difference, that is not saying that it is not as worthwhile, that it doesn't count. But our focus on the consumption of as many books as possible, I have read X number of books, has led to this absolute ridiculous conflation of the act of reading and the act of listening to a performance of a text. It has led to people, when they talk about the book and they have listened to the audiobook, neglecting any praise for the performance of the audiobook narrator, an artist in their own right who has brought this book to life. And they go, oh no, but if I say I listen to the audiobook, people will denigrate that and say it's not the same as reading. You go, it's not the same, but it is just as valuable. Why people ascribe, because they are different, that they are no longer valuable, I don't know. But there is a difference. And we know that there is a difference because people will say that audiobook narrator, when it changed mid-season, it ruined the series for me. Or when you get classical books, which are out of copyright, and there are multiple audiobook versions, you go, oh, that audiobook narrator is great. That one is terrible. It has an impact. If it has an impact, it has to be different to reading, because you don't have that when you read. You are the one in control of all of the accents and the pacing and the stress and the pauses and understanding when a character is in disguise and all of those different aspects that the audiobook narrator is doing for you. So it is a different experience.
Oh, you're muted, I think. Matt?
Oops. Beginner mistake. Raf's point is an interesting one, and it brings up, for me personally, my well-developed analytical muscle, which is design. And what you were saying, AP, like the performance of a text being something that's in between you, I think most people are extremely unaware of the typesetting also being something that's between you and the text. Like I notice it. I opened up 2 different books the other day. And the second one, I immediately said, wow, okay, this has got like amazing leading. The vertical space between the lines is very spaced out. The particular font used, because I think about fonts a lot, immediately without reading anything, gave me a feeling about the book, right? It wasn't like the text, any text on a page to a designer anyway, is not neutral. There's no such thing as a neutral text. Like you have to choose a font, you have to choose a font size, you have to choose leading and margins and all of that sort of stuff. And all of that communicates something. It's not always very conscious. Usually I think a lot of, especially novels, I think a lot of the design of novels is defined by how many pages they have to fit it into because of paper costs and printing costs and all of that. So they're looking for low leading, as many letters on a page as possible, as small as humanly readable, that kind of thing, just to get the page count down. But a well-designed book has a very conscious choice about all of these elements, and they are also kind of a veil between you and some sort of, I don't know, platonic, ideal, totally neutral text as written only. Yeah.
Well, if you want to get into that, you have an author, the editor, the copy editor, the typesetter, and then the edition that all of those things, yes, have an impact. But as soon as you have someone who has decided the accent that a character is having, well, hang on, that's a bit more impactful than, oh, the entire book is written in this typesetter, this font. When you have someone who is adding dramatic pauses to sections, that's not delineated in a text. They've actually changed the reading of a text. But if you said, but they chose a specific font for this text. Yeah. And it does alter the reading experience, as anything that has a physical manifestation will alter it. The choice of the type of paper. If you have a high-end copy on really nice paper or a cheap paperback that is on really nasty paper where the ink has smudged, that will impact your reading experience. But there is something about a performance where someone is actually altering character accent, character intonation, portraying something as angry when it could be just intense. And all of those things can have a staggering impact as opposed to a slightly subtle impact. And that's one of the major things. All aspects of design have importance. But when you radically change a text, if you read Hamlet's to be or not to be speech, you have read the text, and then go out and listen to Laurence Olivier do it, or Kenneth Branagh do it, or Sylvester Stallone do it, and you tell me that the performance of that does not radically change how you interpret that speech, that the audio performance of a text can radically alter a text. And being aware of that is so important for our understanding. And like I said, it doesn't devalue audiobooks. Audiobooks are incredibly valuable for making books more accessible, for lowering the bar of literacy and accessibility to complex texts, to making books, instead of having like space in your home dedicated to all of these dead trees, that you can carry hundreds of them around on your phone or on a simple device. All of these are incredible. Being able to listen to books while you drive or do chores or go out running. This is incredible and brilliant and wonderful and should be celebrated. Yeah. But it's not the same as when it is performed. And
I think AP's right. And I'm actually a little envious of people who are good at listening to audiobooks. I've tried it myself and I'm terrible. I'm absolutely terrible at listening to audiobooks because, as I mentioned earlier, I like to read very slowly. I like to savor the text. I like to think about things. And I would be constantly pausing and rewinding the audiobook in order to do that. So it hasn't worked very well for me, but I'm not very practiced at it. Again, I suspect that the more you practice something, the better you get at it. But I am actually envious of people who are good at listening to audiobooks and take and get the insights that I would probably get from reading the book. So
I was talking to a guy on the Discord the other day, and he put up a list of like everything he read last month, and it was over 30 books. And I was like, sorry, bullshit. I don't believe you. And he was like, no, I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I'm like, yeah, still bullshit. And he's like, I listen to audiobooks on 3 times speed. And I was like, okay, it's not bullshit. You're insane. What is wrong with you? I can't even imagine that. I don't really do audiobooks either. I'm going to give them a try soon because I'm starting a new job in a couple of weeks. And I'm going to have a fair bit of commuting where it would be very inconvenient commuting to sit down and read a physical book. And I'm going to try some audiobooks and we'll see how it goes. But I've tried it a couple of times before and I've just been like, nah.
And it's interesting because when you read a text, and so let's say you're reading a piece of dialogue on an audiobook, the performer has chosen the stance of that dialogue. And so it might be someone being snide. And so they've read it in that tone. And so you read it and go, oh, hang on a sec. I've never read it that way. What if their tone was more sarcastic? Or what if it was cynical? Or what if it was obsequious? And because you as reader project that onto it, it's much more difficult to do that with an audio performance because we're listening to their interpretation of that section. Whereas as a reader, sometimes we go back over it and go, because of a revelation about the character, even like later on in the scene, we go back and re-examine it and go, oh, that actually, this would make more sense if it was read in this tone. Or there are different ways of playing with this because the author has left room for a reader to create their own interpretation. There's a flexibility to it. But with a performance, it's fixed in one interpretation and one interpretation only. What Raf points out there, that the audio performance is a fixed interpretation. So it's like the play of Hamlet, but only one version of that play is the one that you get. You can't get Branagh's Hamlet versus Olivier's Hamlet. You will only ever get Branagh, and only ever that one version of it. And that's what I think of as one of the big differences. And I think people get very upset when you say that listening to an audiobook is not the same as reading. And I don't think you need to be, because however you want to enjoy the text, if that's what you get most enjoyment out of, then that makes it absolutely fine. It's fine. You've enjoyed it that way. But to say that there's no difference is negating the fact that there are huge performative differences.
It sort of goes back to something you mentioned earlier, and we were talking about it a few weeks ago, AP. It's conflating I don't like it with it's not good. It's in a way it's a similar thing. It's like they are different. They are demonstrably, objectively different. Of course, like it doesn't seem logical that should be any argument about that. When you start saying this is good and that's bad, that's a different thing.
Yeah. Right.
But, you know, of course, listening to someone read a book is different than looking at a page with text on it.
What do you think about nonfiction books for audiobooks? Because I did one of those recently. I don't do very many audiobooks at all, and I tend to pick them up only if it's honestly something that I don't find as important as some other things that I'm reading, like a book that, you know, just pops up in the library that looks interesting. But I did a nonfiction book recently that was audiobook, and I enjoyed that, I think, more than reading fiction.
And yeah, a lot of that comes down to what we're doing, why we're doing, who's performing it. Or, I mean, think of the number of lectures that we've listened to. That is essentially performative nonfiction. That's an audiobook. They have a script, a lecture script, and we've listened to it. And there are lecturers I've learned under who I thought were brilliant lecturers because of how they performed their non-fiction work. There are other lecturers who were brilliant at writing, but sucked at giving the lecture, because any interest that you're just they're droning on and oh my God, someone just shoot me now. My undergraduate hangover wasn't this bad. Any way that helps you access and understand is good. And when we think of, so lectures are an easy example of when we have performative nonfiction, oral nonfiction. But also, if you're listening to a radio news bulletin, that is audio nonfiction. And we go, oh yeah, but you know, that's fine. I don't have a big issue over the I've listened to far more opera than I've ever watched. But weirdly enough, we don't have an issue with any of those other things. It's only somehow when it comes to the consumption of fiction that there's this weirdly competitive thing for no apparent reason. And you go, I don't understand that. But we consume so much narrative content, be it fiction, nonfiction. The books that are history books that are narrativized, and history books that are ostensibly more fact-based and not narrative. And then, you know, you get someone like me comes along and goes, oh, well, you've narrativized this whole section. Look at your choice of words here. That's putting a certain spin on the events. Freedom fighter instead of terrorist is the classic example of the two polar opposites, depending on which side of a conflict you're on. That as soon as you choose one of them, you are creating a narrative out of that event. But listening and gaining information that way, I'm all for it. As a lecturer, as someone who used to teach lectures, I understand the importance of it and how important it can be for students, and a great way to learn. But also, that's why, you know, we sometimes give parts of our lecture script to the students as a handout, or we give readings. Go and read this section of the textbook. My lecture is designed to work with that, so that all of the different ways of approaching and understanding the information, the different ways that will work for different people, we try to combine them together. And that's, you know, one of the things that makes it very, very successful.
Silence.
That answer the point.
Does anyone in the chat have questions for any of our guests or me? But I don't have that much smart stuff to say.
Matt, I will be back in just a second.
No worries. Okay, I'll take this opportunity to ask Herr Professor Dr. Fantasy, how's your book going?
Oh, good Lord. Well, I'm having a blast revising the third book in the trilogy. And in response to, and I can talk about him because he's not here, ha ha ha. In response to my developmental editor's suggestions. So I am now editing.
Your developmental editor nemesis.
The nemesis, yes. Yes. Who has read all three books now, and I have edited the first two already after talking with him and having him read and giving me some really, really cool ideas. I can't wait for the books to be published, and then I can tell people that little bit right there, that was AP's idea. Because there are some really cool ideas that are in there that I'm going to be happy to say that was AP actually who suggested I do that. But yeah, I'm going through the third book now, and I just love editing. And maybe that sounds like a really weird thing to say. I love editing. It's just fun and tweaking and trying to make the book better and better. Probably I've done too much of that, to be honest, but it's just a process that I enjoy. So why not? As far as publishing goes, I am not expecting anything to happen really anytime soon. The fact of the matter is the publishing industry, you may or may not have heard, but since the pandemic, they've been really, 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 really backlogged. And a lot of that was to do with the pandemic. And a lot of it was to do with the fact that editors were working from home during the pandemic and sort of got used to not working 80 hours a week. And after they returned to their offices, just said, look, we're not going back to 80 hours a week. We're going to have normal work weeks. So that has added to the backlog. So it now takes several months between an agent submitting your manuscript and an editor saying, okay, I got your manuscript, because there's this huge backlog right now. So I haven't heard anything since my agent submitted the manuscripts. It hasn't been 3 months yet. So I'm not really making any conclusions from that at the moment, because that's just the state of the publishing industry. But I will say, if it becomes clear that no publisher is going to take my books, I will self-publish the books. So one way or another, I'm hoping next year the books will be out, and that people, I want to share the story with people, and hopefully, I tried my best to make a beautiful story, and I had some help from this guy here, and and I hope that some people will find it beautiful. So yeah,
we want to read it.
Wow. Well, yeah, I would be honored for anyone to read it. And, I like I said, I've tried to make something beautiful, and I hope that it'll be, people will experience it that way. Thank you.
Yeah, that would have been my next question is he any good, AP?
Oh, no, hang on a sec. He's my nemesis. No, it is absolutely terrible. No one should ever read it. It is horrendous and horrible. But from, like a professional standpoint, yeah, it's really good. And I hate having to admit that because he's my nemesis.
Yeah. I asked for questions from the chat. So let's take a couple. Wait, no, that wasn't the one I wanted. I wanted this one. I think I can answer this for both of us. I have not read it because it's not yet there in my Malaz Everything /read. It is coming up in a couple of books. I just read Blood Follows, which is one of the Bokelan and Corberbroach.
Oh, so you have started the novellas. Okay, cool.
Yeah, well, that one comes in between Memories of Ice and House of Chains. Yeah, just in concurrent pub order. So yeah. I read that one. I guess I can answer for Josh. No, I'm betting.
That's correct.
Because I'm assuming Josh hasn't read any Malazan stuff, so also not that. And for context, I think that question is being asked by Nilani Ruthan.
It's Ruthan Bad, and he's asking because that's
it's
where you
Ruthan.
meet Apto Canavalian, who is
Exactly.
based on someone we know, who's
Exactly.
actually close biographical sketch of a certain critic that we all know and love.
Any resemblance between myself and the character Apto Canavalian is entirely coincidental.
I'm sure. Does he get horribly killed? I'm totally fine with spoilers.
I mean,
No, that would be spoiling it for other people.
That would be spoiling. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, come on. Okay.
But we will say that he's a very slippery fellow.
That does not surprise me. Yeah. So Derry is asking what we are all currently reading. Why don't we go with you first, Josh?
I'm about 250 pages into Babel by R.F. Kuang, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I think so far I'm liking it more than the Poppy War trilogy. I feel like this is the book that she's kind of meant to write. I did a tweet the other day. One of the topics in this book that I'm finding so fascinating is translation. And she gets very deep into etymology and translation. And I'm kind of one of those readers, and actually all media consumption, I kind of get hooked into what I'm, reading, what I'm processing, or what I'm watching. Like when I read Pillars of the Earth, I got really into architecture for a while. But now that I'm reading Babel, I've been Googling etymology and translation, and I'm thinking, I want to reread this Russian classic with a different translator. And it's just got my brain thinking. And I think just with her background, this is the kind of story she was meant to tell. I can't endorse it yet. I'm only 250 pages into a 600-page book, but I'm really enjoying it so far.
I saw some of your comments, Josh, when you were talking about that, and it made me think a lot of my own experience, because I speak fluent German and I live in Germany, but it's not my native language. But my German has gotten to a certain point where there are things that I will say to people when I'm speaking English automatically in German because they're untranslatable, or at least not the real flavor of it doesn't come across when you translate it, or there isn't a convenient thing for it. And there are just certain words in German that I've learned because I've been here for 18 years and I have the feeling finally. It took a long time, but I think I don't know how to say that to you in English, and the translation is a super interesting subject.
Well, and I think even one thing I've always done in my teaching is when music is written with mostly Italian terms for the most part. You do get works that have German and occasionally even English, but most of the time our terms are written in Italian. And I'm always trying to get to the very root of what the word really means. Like, as an example, there's a tempo called moderato, and you ask a student, what's moderato mean? Oh, it means moderate. No, it means restrained. And that's the textbook definition from Italian. And for me, that gives a much more visceral connection to what the composer really meant when we want this. Okay, this is something that could move forward, but we're going to restrain ourselves, and it should feel like that when we perform it. So I've always been interested in that, but this, just because I'm reading it right now and just looking at, different words and where they came from and where you thought they came from and they didn't come from, it's just very fascinating to me right now.
I remember at one of the conferences, I was on a panel with a couple of other people. We're all talking about Tolkien, and we were talking about the Lord of the Rings and why it still was important for the field. And one of the guests on the panel was a translator who was working on a new Mandarin translation of Tolkien. And it was absolutely fascinating because trying to work out, particularly with fantasy, usually in straightforward prose, there are a lot of relatively straightforward analogues for something to convey the same meaning. But when you take fantasy terms, so like Rivendell, how do you translate Rivendell into another language? What's the meaning that you are going to attach to it? Do you translate the two different parts, Riven to break apart, and Dale as in a a place in a wooded thing with a little river going through it. Is that what you're going to translate? Or do you translate the feel of it, of a valley space that has light shining through it? How do you translate fantasy terms, these made up words that have a feel or a connotation in English? How do you convey that in a foreign language? And up until that point, I hadn't really thought that much about it, because all of the fantasy I was reading, all of the books that I was reading were pretty much written in English, and therefore I was engaging with the source text. And then I thought of the ancient epics, or the Norse myths. So the Greek and the Roman myths and epics that I'd read, the Norse myths, the Old English texts, the early Arthurian saga stuff, all of which I had read in translation. And it made me start to think about how that changed what was actually on the page. And then a step removed from that again, which is actually a related point, is when something is written 200 years ago, the mode and manner and cultural norms are radically different to now. So even though the words are the same, they might have a very different meaning, or they might imply something. And so when you're reading Shakespeare, and there's a joke about in the Winter's Tale, where Autolycus meets the two cowherds, the two shepherdesses, and there's a joke about him wearing or trying to grab their placket or something. And obviously, the translation is placket was an apron front. You go, right, well, what's the big deal? And it was then like the teacher had to explain, well, apron front in the same way that a cod piece was a frontage for trousers or trews. And therefore, it's an innuendo about that aspect of female anatomy. And suddenly, like something that you would have gone, well, it's just an apron. And the associations we have with that was taken to a completely different sphere of reference. And it was actually meant to be read as a dirty joke. And it changes how you read. It changes your appreciation when you get this sort of deeper knowledge. And translation, both direct translation in terms of language, but also translation in terms of time, that temporal dislocation, that can be really, really interesting. And I wish that I had spent more time younger learning languages. And it's a great regret of mine.
I've been getting kind of curious to, because I can now read Lord of the Rings in German, because part of what you were talking about, like the translation of things, they translate everything. So Bilbo Baggins is not Bilbo Baggins, even though it's like a personal name. In the German version, his name is Bilbo Beutlin, and Beutel is a small bag. Yeah, it's like a pouch. So they in some place, and Rivendell is called Bruchtal, which literally means broken valley, which is
Rivendell.
Yeah, but it's funny. I think Raph and I were talking about this online at some point. There's a feeling to it, and maybe it's just because I'm German as a second language. I'm not native, but when I heard Bruchtal for the first time, I heard Broken Valley. When I heard Rivendell the first time, it wasn't that relevant to me in a way. I mean, Riven and Dell are not words we necessarily use every day in English. And it just sounded like a romantic kind of place name where elves might live. And I didn't think about what does Riven and what does Dell mean. But the translated version is much more, to me anyway, much more obvious. I don't know. I mean, other than Raf, I don't know if we have any Germans in the chat. I'd be interested to know whether Germans are also thinking about that. But Bruch is a very common word. Like it has to do with broken, and you would use it quite normally now.
But what's the Shar translated as?
I haven't actually read it in German, but I do know this. I'm just forgetting it right now. Quick, Raf, tell us in the chat.
Raf. Raph,
The,
what's the Shire in German?
is called Auenland. Auenland. Which an Auen is maybe archaic German that I don't really know. So that also just sounds like a name to me. But the interesting thing there for me, like as someone who's doing all of this translating in my head, Auenland doesn't mean anything to me. Because it has land at the end, land, it sounds like it's a place name, but it doesn't have any kind of feeling, whereas Shire immediately feels cozy and maybe safe and that kind of thing to me, because I have associations with that word in English. Yeah. So back to the question though. What are you reading, AP?
Chat. I'm trying to read what they're putting in chat.
I'm pretty sure that Derry meant a book.
Oh, what was it? The Crippled God, a seal.
Don't you read anything else other than Malazan?
Well, I'm editing something,
Oh, okay.
but I can't talk about that.
That's
you read
why.
my book recently, yeah.
And a couple of the Jim Butcher books.
Okay. And Herr Professor Dr. Professor Chase?
Yes. Okay, what am I currently reading? I don't normally read more than one thing at a time, but I am actually reading two things, partly because of when I need to be in a discussion with someone else on one of them. So I'm the one I'm not in a discussion with, but I'm really excited to be reviewing is actually Von Roycroft was in the chat. I don't know if he's still there or not, but he is going to be coming out with a book in mid-October, and it's called The Savoring Sun. And I am reading an arc of that book and really enjoying it a lot. So it has a really cool pre-Christian kind of German tribe sort of vibe to it. It's obviously a fantasy world, but I'm really having a great time with it. I can't wait to review it. And I think that the review is going to depend, the timing is going to depend on when the cover is ready for his book. Oh, yep, he's still there. So yeah, I'm having a blast reading that. It's really exciting to me. And I am also reading a manga for the first time in my life. I started reading manga, and I'm reading, speaking of, there's a manga question right there from Patrick.
Yep.
So, yeah, I have actually, I've actually recorded a couple chats already with Murphy Napier about the Vinland Saga manga, the first two books in Vinland Saga. So I've read the first two books. I'm in the third book now, and we're going to chat pretty soon about books 3 and 4. And so I was pretty open to answer Patrick's question about the use of images and image sequences. It took me probably 5 minutes to get used to going from right to left. I know, AP, that's a problem for you with manga reading. So it did take me a little while, but I have gotten used to it. It's not a breaking point or anything for me. So it's something I'm used to. And I think that probably being a comic book reader when I was young really is serving me well here, because I'm very open to stories being told in a visual medium along with text. And I enjoy sound effects, for example, being conveyed in a manga, where they have the words written at psh, or, bam or plop or whatever. It's fun because, good writing does appeal to all of the senses, right? And so there's that attempt to appeal to the auditory in manga, as well as the visuals right there. Smell is a little bit harder. You can have characters talk about the way something smell-orama, or it's
a scratch and sniff book.
Scratch and sniff book, I guess. Can't really do that, but I'm finding it manga to be very vivid, and it's fun how it relies a lot on hyperbole So there's just a lot of, even the way the characters tend to be illustrated, they have really large eyes, they're very expressive. So it's very, it goes big. Manga tends to go big. I'm learning very fast here. And I'm told that Vinland Saga is not even a very, on the manga scale, it's actually fairly low key. Yeah, it's tame in that sense, I guess. But it's fun. I'm having a lot of fun with it. And the fact that Vinland Saga is based on Icelandic sagas, and that the creator of Vinland Saga really did his homework. It's obvious right away that he immersed himself in the sagas, and he visited Iceland, and I don't know where else. I suspect he visited the UK as well, because some of the stories told during the Viking invasions of the UK or England. It was England back then, not UK. But yeah, it was. It's been really fun. So I appreciate that he's done his homework and he's brought it into this medium of manga, which is I'm just sort of coming to understand a little bit. And Murphy's been really great about helping me understand what manga is all about. So
I recommended it to you, Philip, and I'm guessing by the way he phrased his question that Patrick Lugo has read Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. If you're interested in that sort of stuff at all, it's the kind of analysis that we do about books, but done about comics as a communication medium, and how sequential images tell a story, and how words and image interact, and all of that sort of stuff. It's actually one of the big problems I have with manga, because I'm wearing a fucking Hellboy t-shirt. I'm totally into comics, but I've always only been into Western comics, and I've read them pretty much all my life, and just maybe more grown up comics as I went along. And the cultural sort of visual tropes that manga uses, which probably seem totally normal if you've grown up in Japan and reading manga all your life, I have a really hard time with them. I saw your chat with Murphy, and I also bought Vinland 1 and I read it. And on the one hand, I really enjoyed it. Just in general, it's basically a good story. But on the other hand, the over the top humor, which is just like in the middle of very serious situations, there's just like this totally ridiculous, silly humor, and the insane facial expressions and all of that sort of stuff. I kept sort of getting into the story, and then one of those bits had come up, and I'd be like, oh, again, okay, really? And then I'd ignore it and continue, and then another one would come up, and it just kept pulling me out of the story constantly. And I'm sure it just flows if that's your cultural frame. You don't think of it. It's just, this is the way comics are. But it's very different than Western comics. So I've been struggling with it a bit, but I'm continuing. I got Vinland 2. I've got it on my bedside table, so I'm working on it.
Matt, in addition to Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, another good one that's really, really easy is 99 Ways to Tell a Story by Matt.
And while you're thinking of that, I will mention, AP, because you probably are too modest to mention it, the fact that AP, you wrote your master's thesis on the Sandman, correct? Am I remembering?
Yeah, the master's was on the Sandman.
Yeah, not your PhD dissertation, your master's thesis. So I would imagine that
it's Matt Madden.
Yes, 99 Ways to Tell a Story by Matt Madden.
Just looked it up.
It's a book of essentially every page is a one page of the same story, but by changing the image in the frame, the order of the frames, it goes through how you change perspective, tone, style, changing everything about that story. So it is really good for understanding how perspective and point of view work in all narrative, how the frames and the gutters and the layout of a comic book can change your understanding, how different typology and things being bolded or not can change things, whether or not you explicitly detail something, even the shape of the speech bubbles or the inserts. It is an absolutely brilliant way to show the sheer range and variety of something that is an incredibly simple, straightforward, short sequence of events can be told in completely different ways. And it's very, very useful for understanding how comic books work. But it's also incredibly useful for understanding how literature and film and any sort of story work.
Josh, are you a manga reader or a comic book reader?
I'm not either. I have a couple comic collections from Firefly. I love that television show, and anytime I got more of that show, whether it's in some of the novels or the comics, I've kind of devoured that. But I was never a comic book reader at all.
Okay.
I've just pulled up another question. What book or book series got you hooked on reading? I will answer this really quickly because it's extremely at the forefront of my mind, because I spent this afternoon cutting a video on the different editions of Lord of the Rings that I own. When I was 9 years old, my mother gave me a box set of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the Silver Jubilee edition, with Brothers Hildebrandt covers. They used to be really big in fantasy covers. They did the covers for the old editions of The Wheel of Time, for example. And I read those, and I think as soon as I finished them, I immediately reread them, and I've reread The Lord of the Rings somewhere over 10 times. It's sort of been a comfort read every couple of years, most of my life. So yeah, definitely Professor Tolkien got me going. What about you guys?
Mine was the same, kind of. I answered this in my live stream.
My mother gave you the Silver Jubilee anniversary.
My mother gave me a different box set of Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
No, that's what cemented me into fantasy, for sure. I was 12 when I read Lord of the Rings. And I mentioned in my live stream earlier, I've read it 4 times now and get something different each and every time. But to truly answer this question, what book or book series got me hooked on reading, I had to go back earlier. I would say that mine were the Hardy Boys mysteries.
Oh.
When I was like 2nd and 3rd grade, I remember distinctly I read all of them, and I got through all of them by 3rd grade, and there were so many of those. And that's really what got me hooked as a reader. But as far as a fantasy, reader, it's definitely Lord of the Rings.
Did you do the 3 investigators as well as the Hardy Boys? Or did you just go classic old school the Hardy Boys?
Just old school Hardy Boys, and then Nancy Drew, because I was out of Hardy Boys and somebody told me it was basically the same author that wrote all of them. So I read all of those after that.
Yeah, well, I'm going to just jump on the bandwagon here, I guess. Lord of the Rings. In my case, I was probably about the same age as Josh, I think 12 or so when I first read it. And when I read it, I was so moved that I said to myself, I want to do this. This is what I want to do, which is to say, somehow create a story that does this to people, that creates this incredible sense of beauty and catharsis and everything else. And so somehow I got the idea that I wanted to write after reading Lord of the Rings. And so what did I do? I went to graduate school to learn Old English and Old Norse and be a professor of obscure medieval stuff, because I thought that's what you had to do to be a fantasy writer, so I was taking the scenic route to writing fantasy, I guess, that way. But yeah, I was so inspired by Tolkien, I guess, that I wanted to be Tolkien. Why do you think I'm wearing this jacket? I mean, come on. So yeah, I mean, it was
Where's the pipe, Philip? Where's the pipe?
I have a pipe, but I don't smoke.
I'm sure you have a pipe.
I could put it in my mouth and pretend, but yeah.
I think you should. I really think you should.
Okay.
I didn't mean instantly, necessarily.
He's so susceptible to suggestion.
Apparently. I also think you should transfer me $1,000, Philip. Much better. Herr Professor Dr. Tolkien.
Oh.
Paul's going to make that into a meme. Watch out.
Paul's not watching.
Get it for replay.
I can now imagine the back cover of Philip's book where that's going to be the author photo of him sitting there.
Yep. What about you, AP? What got you started? Or hooked?
To be perfectly honest, I honestly can't remember because I have always read. The earliest books that I remember reading are definitely not the things that got me into reading, because I remember my parents had subscribed to it was like a children's magazine thing that was, it had a book on it. It was a book of, or a magazine of short stories, and it was a mixture of children's versions of folklore and folktale and fairy tale, as well as children's classics that had been broken up and were serialized. And you could play the tape, and it would be the audiobook for it, people narrating it, and you read along. It was to help children learn how to read. And that was called Storyteller or something like that. And I remember those from a young age. But I also remember I had collections of fairy tales for, it was fairy tales for 5-year-olds or something. And it was like a book of in large font, but you read yourself. And my parents were always really supportive when I was a kid of buying books and having books that I could access. So I honestly don't remember what started me reading, because as long as I can remember, I have loved reading. And there is no, oh, this got me into reading. It was, no, I always read. And I can remember, I'm one of the few people who doesn't like The Hobbit. And the reason I didn't like The Hobbit was I read The Lord of the Rings first. Huh. And I'd read The Lord of the Rings, but this is brilliant. And I then was given, here's another book by the same author. And I was given The Hobbit, and I went in with the expectation that The Hobbit was going to be like The Lord of the Rings. And I went, what's this children's crap? Bearing in mind, I was still a child.
Not only...
It feels like a step down.
Yeah. Not only does he hate audiobooks, he hates hobbits. He hates puppies. He hates small children. I mean...
But I never grew to appreciate
he hates
The
kittens.
Hobbit. I never grew to appreciate The Hobbit the same way that I loved The Lord of the Rings. And it was like The Lord of the Rings, Frank Herbert's Dune saga, then a lot of the Forgotten Realms stuff and the Dragonlance stuff, and David Eddings and David Gemmell, and a lot of Arthurian retellings. But I'm hard pressed to remember which authors' versions of it they were, because a lot of it was different versions of translations and then adapted for certain age groups. But it was certainly The Lord of the Rings was the thing that made me love fantasy. Dune was what got me into science fiction. And then going down to the local bookshop and going, right, there's an author who's written a bunch of stuff. Getting my mom to buy me every once in a while the next book. Going down to the library and going, right, where's your fantasy section? Right. And just starting and reading along what had been published and what they had access to. Like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman were very formative in my reading. The Deathgate Cycle, the Dragonlance books. R.A. Salvatore's Icewind Dale trilogy. And then the Dark Elf trilogy and all of that stuff. The Cleric Quintet that he did. But Douglas Niles' Moonshade trilogy. Ed Greenwood's Elminster books. Which, you look at now and go, why did I like this when I was younger? But they were there. They were the books that I read. Melanie Rawn's Dragon Prince, I think it was called. Raymond E. Feist, Magician. And that, which introduced me obviously to Johnny Wirtz because of Daughter of the Empire. That suddenly, as soon as I started, it opened the door to all of those works. And then when I'd run out of my local shop, I'd run out of sort of the library was giving me access to older works, Ursula Le Guin and Andre Norton, and some of those books. And it's like reaching back now for some of the stuff that I read, but it was all part of this whole journey. And I loved science fiction and I loved fantasy. And it was only when I went to specialize for my PhD that I went into fantasy, because I did my MA in science fiction.
Another one for me when I was a kid, before Tolkien, I actually read Lloyd Alexander's The Chronicles of Prydain. That was, I think, the first fantasy I read. And I loved it. It was cool. I haven't read it since. It would be kind of interesting to reread it and see how I experience it as a much older person.
I reread it in January, actually.
Oh, neat. Yeah.
Yeah, because that was my very first fantasy. I mean, Lord of the Rings is the one that hooked me, but that was my first fantasy. I saw the cover of the Book of Three on the library shelf, and I just picked it up, and I enjoyed it. I mean, it's middle grade. So you have to realize that going in. But I dare say the fourth book is very existential. It got really good thematically, and I thought it ended very, very well. So I think you'd enjoy it if you picked it up. You could read it really quick. I mean, they're tiny, tiny books, but yeah, mine was the very first series as well.
Wow.
Did you ever read Diana Wynne Jones? The one that immediately springs to mind is Howl's Moving Castle.
Yeah.
That was one of my favorites when I was younger, and it was Jenny, might have been Jenny Nimmo and the Snow Spider was another one that I adored when I was younger.
Yeah.
It's been kind of funny for me because most of my life I've read fantasy and science fiction, and I haven't had hardly any friends who did. So I didn't really have anyone to bounce it off. And I pretty much all of my life, and I'm not young anymore, I've assumed that if you read fantasy, you've read The Lord of the Rings. And boy, in the last couple of months on Booktube, have I gotten an education in that. There's a whole other generation or two who, of course, love the movies, maybe. And for them, that's Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And
or Harry Potter is the new generation's Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. Like everybody of that generation has read Harry Potter. That's what they started with, and they maybe haven't gone any further back than that in their sort of backwards reading. And I've been thinking about hosting a Lord of the Rings read and reread at some point, because I don't know if that works though. You know, I'm not really sure that, like, with more modern, younger sensibilities, with no sentimental attachment to the book, like I have, whether reading it is going to be something that's really going to turn somebody on if they're 25 or 30 or whatever.
Well, there are YouTube channels dedicated to Tolkien that do very well on YouTube. I know. I'm not so plugged into those communities, but they exist. So obviously there's an audience out there. I've found that in our particular corner of fantasy Booktube, that's what we want to call it, that Tolkien videos don't tend to do very well. That a lot of people just feel like, okay, yeah, I don't want to go to that old stuff. I think maybe, I don't know. I'm not sure why, but the Tolkien content, and it's not just me. I've heard other people in our area of Booktube talk about this, that Tolkien content doesn't tend to do super well.
Mike's talked about that on his channel a couple times.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's been rereading it recently and has put up a couple of videos in the last few weeks. Yeah.
If anyone pays attention to numbers and knows what videos do well and what don't, Mike has a very good sense of that. So
yeah. Derry says that Jimmy Fantasy Network is doing a Lord of the Rings read along next month, which will not work for me, unfortunately, because next month for me is Oztober, and I'm only reading Australian authors. So
Australian or Antipodean? Like, are you going to allow a couple of New Zealanders in there, or is it just Australian?
Nah, fuck the Kiwis. It's only Australians.
Because there was, I think he's an Australian.
I don't have a Kiwi passport. I have an Australian passport, so I'm just reading the Australians.
Is it Russell Kirkpatrick? Did 2 different fantasy trilogies. I think it's Russell Kirkpatrick. and he was a cartographer, and he has some of the best fantasy maps ever. And it's very Tolkien-esque in terms of the story it's telling. But you also have, I suppose, isn't Trudy Canavan an Australian author?
Derry, I was joking. I know you're a Kiwi.
Too late.
I wasn't.
For those of you who don't know, Derry is a Kiwi. He's from New Zealand.
Derry's a Kiwi. She's in New Zealand, and I maybe shouldn't have said fuck the Kiwis. So I wasn't being serious, Derry. You know I love you. No, I will be reading. Who is it? E.J. Beaton. The Brothers Gwyn highly recommended The Counselor, which is a nice change of pace because it's only like 2 fingers thick. It's not like a whole fist thick like Malazan books. And Sam Hawke, who I had never heard of, but E.J. Beaton actually recommended Sam to me on Twitter. And I've discovered the best first line in a book, or at least my current favorite first line in a book. Sam Hawke's book is called City of Lies. The first line is, "I was 7 years old the first time my uncle poisoned me." I'm like, okay, I have a million questions I want answered, so I'm very interested. And I'm reading the first book in the Licinius trilogy by Eilington, who's an Aussie, and Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff. So those are my. I'm a slow reader, so four books, one of which is like this thick, is probably enough for me. So I think we've run out of questions. One of the things I had noted, because Josh and I were talking before the stream, you said you had a question about one of AP's videos.
Oh yeah, so it kind of came up when I was shooting a video this morning. Your video about it's a reader problem, not a writer problem, or an author problem, or something like that. Because I was thinking about that, because I've always taken that stance that if I don't get something, I usually think it's on me and not the author. But in this case, I think it might have been the author. But I don't know. I think the topic is great because, again, going back to my musical training, you know, we're always taught that if you're playing in a group and someone's out of tune, always assume it's you. At a very minimum, you're going to listen more closely. And maybe you'll find out it's you. Maybe you'll find out it isn't. But at a bare minimum, you're listening better than you were before. So I've always taken that as a reader as well. I assume that if I don't get something, well, it's on me. I missed something. But in this case, I was trying to straddle the line. I don't know if I did. I haven't edited yet, but I was trying to straddle the line, and I didn't think I could take the whole blame on it.
It's, to be perfectly honest, sometimes there is a disconnect between author and reader. And if there is a disconnect between author and reader, it is going to be usually one of two parties, the author or the reader. You know, it's just perfectly logical. And part of the reason why I made that video is we spend a lot of time, because of the prevalence of thought of essentially an extension and almost misunderstanding of Death of the Author, but what Death of the Author was arguing against. And it has led to this hyper focus and excuse for individual readings. And we talk about the valid reader experience, which means everything is being placed on the reader. That and anything that the reader thinks, because they've interpreted the text, must be valid. You go, but unless all readers are superhuman, that's overlooking the fact that we're fallible, we can make mistakes. That just because we have in our head, this is what this section means, does not mean that that is true. because we could have misinterpreted something, we could have misunderstood something, we could have misread. And because we focus so much on the individual take on a book, and we discount and devalue the author, if you're going to do that, you have to be aware then that the person who is constructing meaning is the author, or sorry, is the reader. And if the person who is constructing meaning is the reader, and the book then fails, the person who has created the failed meaning, the failed narrative, is actually the reader, not the author, who you've completely ignored and said, oh, the author doesn't exist, death of the author, there is no author here, I don't have to consider the author. The text is a thing, and there is no communication. It is my interpretation, and that is everything. You go, in which case, if it doesn't work for you, it's your fault. Which I think is, the logical extension of completely ignoring the author at all, is that you have to recognize then if a book fails, it's your fault. But I think that, again, is making the argument actually too far to one extreme. Just as completely ignoring the author is too far to the other way, putting everything on the reader is too far. That we think of a text as this series of symbols that we are interpreting. And we can physically skip a line when we read. We can read a word oppressed, and instead we've read it as repressed. We've changed the meaning in our head to a different word. And that happens, particularly with a lot of similar words. And that can actually change the meaning of a sentence. And it can change, that sentence then could have been a key sentence, which changes the meaning of a paragraph. Because of that, that paragraph could be a key paragraph that changes the meaning of a scene. And next thing you know, you have a whole string of dominoes that are falling because of one misinterpretation or one misreading. And when authors build in space for interpretation, where there is ambiguity in the text, there's usually a limit to that space. That, you know, you don't read The Lord of the Rings and go, oh, this is telling me so much about the mating habits of aardvarks. Because that's not in the text of The Lord of the Rings. If you're getting meaning out of The Lord of the Rings, it's about the mating habits.
It's in one of the appendices.
Or maybe in your special edition.
Everything is in the appendices. Everything.
But texts have finite bounds. And while, when you think about it, you go, well, it could be read by an infinite number of readers, therefore there's an infinite number of interpretations. There's an infinite number of valid interpretations, but then there must also be an infinite number of invalid interpretations. So that doesn't help anyone to extend it that far. So if you think about it in terms of bounds of meaning, yes, you can have a very personal interpretation, but there's usually an overlap. And that's, you know, when we talk about poetry, we talk about the accepted reading, that we sort of come down on, this seems to be the majority approach and way of understanding it, and it's backed up by evidence from the text. That's the accepted reading of a poem. But you can have a very personal interpretation of a poem. Let's say you're talking about stopping by woods on a snowy evening, and you had a traumatic experience as a child being buried in snow. Therefore, when Robert Frost's poem is talking about the snow, your individual experience is having this visceral fear of snow, which is antithetical to an aspect of how it's being portrayed in the poem. So if you said this poem is all about the horror of snow, that might be what it feels like to you, but it's clearly not based in the text. It's based on a personal association that you have. And so being able to step outside of that to see what and this is where we get into tricky terminology, what a text is doing. Because the text obviously is an object that does not have conscious will of its own. It's not doing anything. But what the text is trying to convey, or the author is trying to convey through the text. And because when we think about it in terms of communication, that's when we can take into account potential authorial intent as one way we are meant to understand the text, but that does not supersede, nor does it invalidate how we have interpreted the text, and we put the two in conversation. And where they align, that's where we can say the author effectively communicated the text. Where they don't align, that shows us areas of a text which should bear further scrutiny. Because if we have a different interpretation than what the author did, that's an area of the text that could be really interesting. Because why have we interpreted it differently to the author? And it could be that we have misunderstood, or the author failed to communicate their intent. And That's basically what my video was about.
So in other words, if you DNF or break up with a book, you just tell it, it's not you, sweetheart, it's me.
Well put. Well put.
In this particular case, you actually really mean it. Because usually when you say that, it's just a way to get out.
Yeah, well, maybe when you say it, I don't know.
Guys, I'm becoming very aware of the fact that we've been doing this for 2 hours and 40 minutes, which is a great way to spend an afternoon for you, but it's almost 11 p.m. here.
Now it's late.
Yeah, a little earlier for AP. It has been a great pleasure to have you on my first Friends with Books. Thank you all so much for coming, especially you, Josh, for jumping in heroically at the last minute.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Nuts can go to hell.
Not only jumping in heroically, but after doing his own live stream. My goodness.
Doubly heroically.
Yeah.
Well, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. It's always a pleasure to talk to you guys and learn something from you with well-developed analytical muscles. And thanks to everybody in the chat. It's been great. Lots of good questions.
Even the Kiwis.
I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, especially the Kiwi. I think there's only one, but I think that's just because Derry's the only person in New Zealand who can read. But you know,
stop digging now. Just stop.
It's actually as an Australian, it's kind of my duty to diss Kiwis occasionally. The Kiwis tell Australian jokes, and the Australians tell Kiwi jokes. So, you know, that's just how it is. I hope she knows that it's all in fun. I actually love New Zealand. I would love to live there. Beautiful place.
Yeah, same here.
Australia's a big, horrible desert that looks like a post-apocalyptic wasteland, like 90% of our country. New Zealand looks like
paradise.
Middle Earth. Yeah. It's absolutely beautiful there. But yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm going to do it again next month. And I thought since this month, it's basically a sausage fest of old guys. Next month, it's me and three ladies. So Joanna. Actually, Joanna is Joanna.
It's your German coming out there, Matt.
Actually, it's my ex-girlfriend from Denmark.
Oh no!
Her name is Johanne. Yeah, if you pronounce it Danish.
Yeah,
and it's spelled almost exactly the same. And every time I see the word, I just think that anyway. Joanna, if you're still in the chat, she's going to be in it, and Jordan from Jordan Reads, and Tori from Tori Talks. So I'm really looking forward to that next month. And it's been a pleasure beginning Friends on Books with you guys. Have a lovely evening, you all and everybody else in the chat.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
See ya.